Let's proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I indicated before the break that we would be dealing with an affidavit of a Mr. Lowenthal. You'll find that in Exhibit DD10A, right at the end, and it commences at page 238.274.
I've got it, thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Nasson, do you have it?
There you go.
Ms. Nasson, this was an affidavit that was forwarded to the Commission yesterday evening, is that correct?
That's correct.
And please explain to us who Mr. Lowenthal is.
He's an independent expert that I appointed straight after the testimony that I gave in July to come in and assist us with, firstly, with the books, the reconstruction of the books, as well as advising me in terms of my obligations as a chartered accountant in business.
Did his brief include preparing this affidavit?
Yes.
So has he been remunerated for preparing this affidavit?
Correct.
And can you just confirm, he indicates at paragraph 1 that he's an adult male chartered accountant. He doesn't indicate any legal training. Are you aware of him being a lawyer?
No, I'm not aware that he's a lawyer.
Thank you. And can I just clarify, he talks in this affidavit about a number of facts related to what has gone on in NEO Solutions. Can we assume that he learnt of those facts through you?
Yes, through me, and obviously engaging with the team now assisting with the reconstruction of the books.
Thank you. If we go over the page to page 238.275, you'll see at the top of that page, paragraph 5, Mr. Lowenthal says, Mr. Natterson informed me that it had recently come to his attention that the signed, unaudited annual financial statements of NEO Solutions that had been handed by staff member Jerome Jones to the Commission were, on closer inspection, materially incorrect or incomplete, and that he advised the Commission that he would arrange to reconcile the accounting records and recompile the unaudited annual financial statements of NEO Solutions for the financial periods ending, but not limited to, the periods ending 2016 and 2017. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you confirm that that is what you informed him?
That's what I told him.
When you say there, then I'm going to deal with what you said to him, that the annual financial statements had been handed by staff member Jerome Jones to the Commission. Why did you indicate to him who presented them to the Commission?
I think when we gave him the brief, I explained that when I was requested to provide the accounting statements, that I informed Jerome, and Jerome is the one who then sent the email across.
Sent the email across to whom?
If it was requested via obviously to the lawyers, but it's not that relevant here. He just brought it up because that was the brief that I gave him at the time.
No,
I think
understand.
it's completeness. But there's no intention as to why Jerome specifically.
Because you would take responsibility, no doubt, for the financial statements of your company that were provided to the Commission.
Yeah, but that's a different context. What he's saying here is not whether I'm taking responsibility or not. It was in the brief. He's captured his brief into his statement.
I understand. So I'm just clarifying with you.
Yeah,
There's no attempt here to distance yourself from the responsibility.
Myself from my role.
Okay, one at a time.
Apologies, Chair. Just to be clear, the 2017 financial statements that were provided to the Commission were provided pursuant to a summons, correct?
That's correct.
And it was a summons to you, correct?
That's right.
And you are responsible for the financial statements that were then forwarded to the Commission by your attorneys?
The ones that were submitted by Jerome to the attorney. Yeah, I'm not, at this point in time, are you trying to establish whether I'm trying to abdicate any responsibility as the person, as the director of the company? The answer is no, I'm not trying to.
Thank you. Mr. Natson, further down on page 7, Mr. Lowenthal defines monies. I just want us to understand what he means by that, because he tracks it through his affidavit. And the definition of monies comes at paragraph 7.3. Do you see that?
Right.
So he says, part of his brief, as I read this, was to investigate how the 9.9 million rand, and then he defines that as the monies, had flowed into and out of NEO Solutions. Is that accurate?
Yes.
So when we talk about monies, I just want to get clarity that you and I understand this affidavit in the same way. It means the 9.9 million that this commission is interested in, correct?
In this context, yes.
Thank you. I'd then like to progress through the affidavit really to the conclusion of the work that Mr. Lowenthal did. And you'll find that at page 238.278. And the sort of conclusory paragraph there is paragraph 12. But maybe you can assist us before we get there in just describing what it was that Mr. Lowenthal did and what it is that he uncovered.
So his objective around accounting for the monies, on the 9.9 million specifically, was to establish that what was received was traced through the bank statements. As part of the reconstruction of records process, his brief with the accounting personnel now was to ensure that it was correctly posted as it should have been to the suspense account called Coroneka. So in the reconstructed books that have been now prepared, or are in the process of being prepared, there is now a suspense account that correctly reflects how it ought to have been at that point in time. But in accounting for the monies, he traced the monies coming in and he traced the monies going out, obviously save for the 300,000 Rand issue.
Did he specifically raise the concern about the 300,000?
What do you mean by concern?
You said he's accounted for everything except the 300,000.
Yeah, he's unable to verify past the point of my representation that he was paid the cash. Obviously, so that's the only point that he was. Obviously, the journal entry around the 300 is a journal entry in the suspense account, moving from Coroneka, the amount, which would have been 2.9 on the 4th of January, comes down by 300,000. So at year end, it was 2.6 million, and that 300,000 is in my shareholder loan account, or director's loan account.
So did he raise any concerns around the 300,000?
Not concern. All he said was he can't verify my statement.
Then, if we pick it up at 12, this, as I understand it, is his concluding paragraph in relation to the work that was done. And he says there, accordingly, I confirm that I'm satisfied that the relevant accounting records of NAO Solution as reconstructed now more accurately reflect the monies flow through NAO Solutions for the affected period ended February 2016 and April 2017. Do you see that?
Yes.
As I read that, it tends to suggest that they have now been reconstructed. Is that right?
Those specific accounts have been reconstructed. There are still other suspense accounts that have been created, which we're busy resolving. So until it sits in suspense, until we identify the exact transaction, then it moves either to the correct income statement item or balance sheet item. But he had to focus specifically on these due to urgency of coming back to the commission.
What does he mean when he says now more accurately reflect? Do you know?
You'll have to ask him.
Okay.
He's been hired as an expert, so he will have to come and explain that.
Were you involved with him in the compilation of this affidavit?
No, I saw this affidavit when it was already submitted to the lawyers.
Thank you.
Maybe the question should be, what is your own understanding of what he means there? Because whatever he was doing for your company, and you needed to be satisfied that he has done it properly, and obviously you need to understand what he has put together.
Chair, I mean, I'm
Or
at
did
the
you
risk
not
of speculating,
understand
I mean, in accountant speak, I think that's how they would say it, is that more accurately means it's accurate, but there might be something they might not know. That's how they normally semi-disclaim something, but I can't speculate on his behalf.
Yes, okay.
More accurately, can I just interrogate with you, suggest that they were previously accurate and now they're more accurate. Do you agree with that?
I don't know. To me, they were definitely not accurate, and
Indeed.
I think he starts off by saying they were not accurate,
Yes.
because they were not posted to a suspense account.
Correct.
So when he says more accurately, it's definitely coming from a base that it was not accurate in the first place. Yes, the bank statements are accurate because they reflect that the money's flowed, but anything past that on the journalizing was not accurate.
Indeed. So if you were giving your concluding remarks here, can I take it that you would say the previous manner in which they were captured was not accurate?
I've already testified to say that.
and now they are accurately reflected.
In the current versions, yes.
Thank you. And so the Commission has not yet received these reconstructed financials, has it?
No, as I said, there are still several suspense account items. We are having to go back to suppliers from 3-4 years ago to obtain invoices so that we could correctly post these transactions. So there is quite a long process underway to get that right.
And can you just help me? Is he engaged on a compilation basis?
No. We'll have a separate accounting team that will be appointed for the compilation. He's appointed on a factual findings basis with a specific mandate to address these issues.
So was he specifically asked to satisfy himself as to the accuracy of the treatment that has now been given to the monies?
Yes, as part of the scope.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'd then like to go to how he's treated it in the reconstructed financials, and you'll find that starting to be described at paragraph 13 on that page, 278. Just remind us, previously, how was it accounted for?
It was posted to my loan account.
And you and he have agreed that was incorrect?
Yes, he from the start had said this should have been in the suspense account.
Well, he says here, the way that he's treated it, if you go over the page to 238.279, at paragraph 14, it's really his concluding paragraph again, as I have it. He says, accordingly, I instructed the accounting staff of NAO Solutions to reflect monies, that's the ones we're interested in, as funds held in an interest-free loan account from Van Wyk or his nominee Coroneka, and to be recorded as a liability in a loan ledger account. Do you see that?
Yes.
So do you and he agree that that's the correct treatment?
Yes.
Mr. Natterson, if NAO Solutions had got a loan from a bank and would be very fortunate if it was able to achieve the loan that I'm going to describe, an interest-free loan from a bank that was payable on demand, would it receive the same accounting treatment?
Repeat the question.
So, if NAO Solutions went to a very kind bank and received an interest-free loan repayable on demand, would it also be recorded as a liability in a loan ledger account in its financials?
Definitely not. I don't know if a bank will give you an interest-free loan
in
the first place, so it's very hypothetical what
you're
you're
saying.
saying.
Let's work with the hypothetical. If NAO Solutions got an interest-free loan from a bank, repayable on demand, would it be reflected in the accounting records as a liability in the loan ledger account?
There's no such situation. A bank, any formal institution whose revenue would be based on lending money would always charge interest. If, let's say another institution, if I went and borrowed the money from any other person than the bank, let's say that,
Super.
then that would work, that yes, I would then reflect it as a liability in
Let's
the
think
same
of
way.
another third party then. I can see your difficulty with it being a bank.
Correct.
So another third party loans money to NAO Solutions, interest-free, repayable on demand, you'd reflect it as a liability in the loan ledger account, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. We have already traversed in your evidence that the monies that were received from Coroneka were not ring-fenced, correct?
Yes.
And they were used to fund the cash flow of the business in the period between November and February, correct?
No, I didn't say that. I said they were in our operational bank accounts.
Yes, sorry, you did have an engagement with the chair about that. As I have your evidence, you agreed that it was used in the operations
Correct.
of NAO Solutions.
But not used to fund my cash flow as if there was an intent for it to be used to fund my cash flow. That was not an admission I made. The admission was it was sitting in our operational accounts of the business.
And used in the operations of the business between November 2015 and the end of February 2016,
That's right.
Correct? And that suggests to me that it is quite accurately a loan then to NAO Solutions, is it not?
No, not at all.
So why is it being reflected as a liability in the loan ledger account?
It's reflected as a liability because where else would you post that suspense account? It's a suspense account that's in credit. Therefore, and like I said from the start, no matter what happened, I would owe Brian that money back if he ever came to demand it. So therefore, it's in the right place. But to use the word loan as if he lent us the money is not correct to make that statement.
Ms.
It was
Nathan,
monies that was placed in. The accounting treatment of it was to create a suspense account called Koreneka, and in the final version, the accurate version of the trial balance and the financials that would be produced, it will sit as a liability.
correct.
But to
Ms.
call it a loan in the context that he lent us the money as a loan is not correct.
How does it differ from the hypothetical that we engaged in a moment ago? Can I just explain what I mean by that? We postulated another third party, a company, that lent Neo Solutions an amount of money, interest-free, repayable on demand, that was used in the operations of the business. Would that be a loan?
If you engaged on it being a loan in the first place and the money was lent in the first place, then I agree with you. But this money was not in our books in that way. This was in a suspense account, and the correct placement of this in the suspense account in our financials will be sitting as a liability.
So is your point this, that you would accept it as a loan if when it came on the basis that it was a loan?
Correct.
If it didn't come on that basis, then you would not take it as a loan.
The exact wording, Chair, on our trial balance right now is, it's called suspense account Koreneka.
Yes, I'm trying to make sure that I understand you correctly. The fact that you don't take it as a loan in circumstances where it didn't come to you as a loan in the first place doesn't mean that it is not a liability.
Correct.
On your part.
Yeah,
towards
Chair, I
the
think our
person
learned
who
friend
brought it.
is implying that a loan and a liability are the same thing, right? A liability is an obligation to repay somebody. A loan is where you've borrowed money, and we have not borrowed the money.
So had I understood you correctly?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Ms. Natson, when you take money from another person, let me be clear, when a company like Neo Solutions takes money from another entity to use in its business, which is repayable on demand and which attracts no interest, is that not a loan?
We didn't take the money to use in our business.
As a matter of fact, you did use it, though.
Chair, sorry, could I please maybe add some clarity?
Yeah, come for it.
Thank you. I think my learned colleague from the Commission's legal team is confusing the accounting principles here. As Mr. Knudsen and yourself have said, okay, really what it boils down to is the intention and the nature of the monies that were provided to Neo Solutions. If one looks at Mr. van Wyk's intention in making the payment, albeit channeled through Koreneka, the intention was that the monies be invested for the purposes of farming venture. It wasn't a loan in the strict sense that my learned colleague is referring to that would attract interest in the ordinary course. Okay? Earlier in the testimony this morning, it became clear to everyone that my learned colleague was confusing the aspect of loan account and banking account. She asked the question, what account with a bank is that particular loan account? A loan account is a liability created in the company's books of account indicating its indebtedness to a third party. That third party could be a director, a shareholder, or a bank. So the nature of the money here is all important, and I think Ms. Hofmeyer is confused.
I think so far I certainly understood what Mr. Natterson is saying.
Correct.
Ms. Hofmeyer, she might still have some question, but I do understand what Mr. Natterson says, the distinction that he is putting forward. But we'll hear if Ms. Hofmeyer
Thank you, Chair.
Still has some questions.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Natterson, did you discuss at all with Mr. van Wyk that you would use the funds that he was giving you in the operations of the business?
I've already testified on the basis that the funds were never intended to be with us for any long period of time. It was going to go straight into the farming venture. The fact that it never materialized on time then gave rise to a situation it was kept in the operations. And I've already said several times that should should he have approached us to say return the money, or the farming venture would have turned on, his funds would have then been deployed. So the portions that he utilized back for himself would have had to come back into the farming operation, as well as any monies we would have been sitting with at that point in time. So I think, again, through you, Chair, there was never an intention or a discussion that we would utilize these funds in our operation. It was an unintended consequence of the fact that it didn't move in and out as soon as it was supposed to.
What do you mean by unintended?
The fact that it sat there that long meant it stayed in our books that long. So it would have moved in and out even before our financial year end had the farming operation turned on in the timelines that we were working to.
Mr. Natterson, your previous testimony was that that farming venture was on a long-term trajectory.
No.
Do you recall that?
I recall my testimony as the intention was that we would get it going quickly. Then we realized that the owner was haggling over price. There was a far more detailed investigation that ended up happening. But the initial investigation was it was going to happen very quickly.
And when it didn't happen quickly, did you then engage with him and explain to him that it was being used in the operations of Neo Solution?
No, we didn't, that it was being used in the operation, no.
Thank you. And your evidence then is that there was no loan agreement ever with Mr. Van Wyk, is that right?
No, because as I said, it was going to be put to the farming venture as soon as possible.
And that did not ever happen, correct?
That, well, by then he had withdrawn all his money anyway, by the time we got to the farming venture closure of the project.
If we go over the page to page 238.280, Mr. Natterson, there's a heading there called benefit derived. Before I get the benefit of your understanding of what Mr. Lowenthal is saying here, we'd just like to pick up on an aspect that's relevant to the question of benefit from your testimony this morning. As I understood your testimony, you made it clear that even though you didn't have the 2.6 million available at the end of February sitting as cash in the Neo
Available
Solutions
funds.
bank accounts, had there been a call for it, you would have taken steps to get other facilities. Is that accurate?
To extend our facilities, yes.
Indeed. Those facilities wouldn't come free, would they?
They come at a cost, correct?
Indeed. As I have it from your Nedbank facility agreement, there's at least an activation fee of 50,000 Rand. Do you recall that?
That's on the original agreement, but not for further extensions. They don't charge it on extensions.
There would be some cost associated with the extension, though.
At least an interest cost.
Indeed. So that the fact that you didn't have to acquire those additional facilities was a benefit in the hands of Neo Solutions, was it not?
I think when we deal with this here, we come up with the discussion around benefit derived, Jay. I think post my earlier testimony, we obviously applied our minds to this, and from the advice of Mr. Lowenthal and from a discussion with my own legal team, and from the history of what we've seen, other entities that find out later that they were unknowingly involved in obviously state funds that have flowed through, is then we came up with, let's tender, if there has been an unintended benefit that has been derived now through the interest saving or in terms of the facilities cost, or in a positive balance, if the facility moved to a positive balance, then we would be tendering that we would offer to pay the affected institution the interest component back. And that's the basis of this clause in his affidavit.
I didn't understand Mr. Lowenthal to be postulating the need for further facilities to have been obtained. Did you understand him to be dealing with further facilities in these paragraphs?
No.
Thank you. That's why I was asking before we got to what he had derived as the benefit, a question about if you had to get further facilities.
Correct.
And you accepted that that would come at a cost to Neo Solutions, correct?
Correct.
And your saving of that cost was an additional benefit, correct?
Correct.
Let's now go to what Mr. Lowenthal did do. Explain to us what benefit he concluded was received by Neo Solutions.
So he's computed an amount of 217,494 as the interest saving by us on the overdraft facilities.
And as I have it, you've tended to return that to the appropriate beneficial owner should that ever be required.
Correct.
Would that be Mr. Van Wyk or would that be Coroneka?
It would be the affected state entity that lost these funds, from my understanding.
And at paragraph 19 on that page, 238.280, Mr. Natterson, Mr. Lowenthal there says, owing to the fact that neither Mr. Natterson nor Neo Solutions made specific use of the monies, then he goes on to say there was no intent to benefit either Mr. Natterson or Neo Solutions, as the total monies were received by Neo Solutions were paid out by Neo Solutions within a few months of receipt. Can I just ask, where does he get those facts from, owing to the fact that neither Mr. Natterson nor Neo Solution made specific use of the monies?
That's from obviously from our representations and his interrogation of the accounting team now that's there. But you'll have to ask him this.
So you can't help us on why he says there that Neo Solutions made no specific use?
You'll have to ask him that.
But I understood you say he would have got that information from you or your accounting team, correct?
We gave him the facts as we saw it, and he was appointed to then evaluate those facts and make obviously produce this report.
So, because he wouldn't know those facts, would he?
Well, he was appointed to do an investigation. So through that, he would gain whatever facts he could and then draw inferences from that.
Thank you. And at 20, he goes on and he says, however, there was a consequential unintended benefit that accrued to Neo Solutions due to the fact that the monies, while in the overdrawn bank accounts of Neo Solutions, reduced the overdraft amounts owing by Neo Solutions to the banks. I just want to understand the plural there. Why is he talking about overdrawn bank accounts, overdraft amounts, and banks?
I think you'll have to ask him those wording. He, again, produced the report.
Yes, he's working on the information you give him about your company, correct?
And whatever facts he could gain from the books and records that he was able to detect.
But we mustn't, on the back of your evidence today, read this to suggest that there were other overdraft facilities relevant, because we've confirmed already there was only one bank with an overdraft facility.
Yeah, so you'll have to ask him this.
No, I'm asking a factual question now.
As I said at the start of today, I wasn't sure when the Standard Bank facilities were reinstated. So you, obviously from the records you have, you're saying it wasn't at that point in time. They would have been reinstated during March, and some of the payments happened during the period of March of the next year, the next financial year. So therefore, that might be, but I can't speculate.
Thank you. And why does he call them an unintended benefit? Did you give him that word?
No, that's from his report.
How does he make a conclusion about what the intention was behind the benefit without engaging you about it?
From my explanation, there was never an intention for us to utilize the funds for our business. There was never a loan. So by inference, he would assume then it's unintended. If we never intended it, the intended use of the funds was to move to the farming venture. So anything different to that was not what the intention was.
Thank you. You conveyed that information to him.
I explained the transaction history to him.
Thank you. If we then go over the page to 238.281, I'd like to pick up the topic of unaudited annual financial statements of Neo Solutions. And I'd like to pick it up at paragraph 24 there, if we may, because Mr. Lowenthal, as I read this paragraph, it makes some comments about whether your signature on certain documents resulted in things becoming binding and enforceable against Neo Solutions. Did you ask him particularly to comment on this aspect?
I asked him to look at our obligations, or my obligations, in terms of the fact that there were signed documents that were out there that were inaccurate. And he was then required to respond to that. So these, I am assuming, is in response to that.
Thank you. Do you accept that whether something's binding or enforceable or not is a legal question?
From an accounting perspective, and he's, from my understanding of what Mr. Lowenthal has done, his brief was to look at as well. Apparently, from what I understand, he does testify a lot on matters like this, and from that basis, he looked at it not just purely from an accounting, but an obligation from an accounting perspective in terms of the act, not as a lawyer. But so again, you'll have to call him.
When he says at paragraph 24, maybe you can just read paragraph 24 for us.
So he states here that Neo Solutions is not statutorily required to have audited financial statements, and Mr. Natterson's signature electronic or handwritten, on the compiled, unaudited annual financial statements does not, in my opinion, result in same becoming binding or enforceable against Neo Solutions and or Mr. Natterson, unless specifically having being compiled for reliance upon by a stated known third party for a particular need.
Mr. Natterson, earlier in your evidence today, we traversed the requirement of audited financial statements in your Nedbank facility agreement. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Did you make that known to Mr. Lowenthal before he deposed to this affidavit?
I am not sure if he's had access to the agreement with Nedbank at that point in time.
My question was, did you bring it
No.
to his attention?
As I stated in my testimony, I was only reminded of it now when
A
obviously...
day or so ago when
correct.
the Commission provided you with that
Correct.
agreement. So his conclusion here, as I understand it, is that there's no obligation for as long as no third-party creditor is being asked to place reliance on the financial statements. Do you read it in the same way?
Yes.
And insofar as we've now confirmed, because your memory was refreshed 2 days ago, that there was a legal obligation to provide those audited financial statements, I assume you would then differ from the conclusion he draws here.
You can ask him that, but
Mr. Natterson, the question was, do you differ from the conclusion he draws here?
if the obligation to report to Nedbank was made aware to him, then I agree.
Thank you.
I'm not sure what the value of his opinion is in paragraph 24.
Indeed, Chair.
He's not a lawyer.
Indeed. Insofar, Chair, and the only reason for exploring it, if I may, is insofar as there's any respect in which an expert accountant might be able to shed light on, in accounting practice, what the requirements of audited financial statements are. That's the only reason for probing it further.
Yes.
But we have Mr. Natterson's evidence
Yeah.
on that. Mr. Natterson, the next topic on that page is chartered accountant in business, and we've traversed that already in your evidence. What do you understand Mr. Lowenthal to say about the position of a chartered accountant in business and its application to you?
My understanding from him is my role with the company is operational. I serve more role on projects. I've outsourced the accounting activities to an internal accounting department as well as an externalized accounting practice. So I'm not serving in my capacity as a chartered accountant in the operations of Neo Solutions.
Do you accept, as a chartered accountant, though, the general obligations that apply under the code would still apply to you, even though you're not a chartered accountant in business?
No, I don't agree with that.
So the ethics of the profession of accounting.
The ethics do apply. I've never said that doesn't. In terms of the obligations of looking into detail on the books and results of the operations, I had outsourced that activity.
Agreed. We might have been at cross purposes, so I can just be clear. You accept, I have it from your evidence, that the ethics of the profession continue to apply to you. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you also comply with the obligation to provide annual CPD declarations, given your registration as a chartered accountant?
Yes.
What do those involve?
It involves submitting your timesheets in terms of the work you do.
And I think it relates to ongoing development. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you. And have you done so with SAICA?
Well, we submit the timesheets, and they obviously look at it and see whether it qualifies.
Thank you. And just in terms of those ethical obligations, do you regard it as one of the ethical obligations of an accountant not to bring the profession into disrepute?
Correct.
And do you regard a chartered accountant who signs off on financial statements as accurately reflecting the affairs of the business, where that is not so, could be involved in bringing the profession into disrepute?
I had not signed those financials in any capacity as a chartered accountant, so I don't believe it's relevant.
Oh, so sorry. So if on the page where you signed them, you somewhere put next your name chartered accountant, would then the obligation arise?
No, I'm saying my capacity in the operations of Neo Solutions, I'm a director, and obviously I'm the shareholder of the business, but in the capacity as director and chief executive, I had signed those financials there, but not purporting that I've examined the books and records as any CA would as a service.
Ms. Nathan, we understand each other entirely. Let me just be clear on my question. My question did not suggest that you played the role of a chartered accountant in business, because I've read what Mr. Lowenthal has said, and not that it should be relevant for the present determination, but I don't see a basis on which to refute what he says. That is why the questions have progressed. I'm talking about the general ethical obligations of a chartered accountant wherever they find themselves, and even if they're not conducting the activities of a chartered accountant in business. Do you understand where we are for the question?
Yes.
I understand your evidence to be it's part of the ethical obligations of a chartered accountant not to bring the profession into disrepute, correct?
Yes.
I then asked whether a director of a company who is a chartered accountant, who signs off on financial statements, indicating with his signature that they correctly reflect the financial position of the company in circumstances where they do not, do you regard that as bringing the profession into disrepute?
I've signed those financials on the basis that my internal accounting team, as well as the external accounting team, have done their homework and satisfied themselves that this was correct. Even on the matter of GARP versus IFRS, those financials were prepared by Manny Financial Services. So yes, in the previous testimony, you put me on the spot in terms of saying there should have been IFRS and I should have known better. But the person who's being remunerated to actually prepare those financials should have known better, right? I made a reasonable assumption that the financials brought through to me after Manny has been through them are reasonably correct. And I signed them on that basis.
Does that mean you didn't read the page where your signature appears?
No, I understand what it's saying there, but I'm saying we've satisfied, I understand there's obligations placed back on me as a director of the company. I understand those. I'm not derogating from that. But it also says I must put in reasonable steps within the operation to make sure that they are correct. The undertaking that Manny Financial Services had given me was that they were the vetting agent to make sure that those were correct, which they're now shielding themselves from. But ultimately, after the SARS audit process, they had undertaken to do those steps for me. So I relied on the fact that those steps were being performed.
Thank you. Chair, those conclude our questions in relation to Mr. Natterson's evidence and Mr. Lowenthal's affidavit.
Okay, thank you. Then we can start with re-examination.
If I may just take a moment, Chair, to clear up so that there's space.
Okay,
Indeed.
that's fine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. You may proceed.
Before I start, Chair, I'd just like to go back to an issue raised by my learned colleague this morning with regards to Ms. Tlatsana's recent absence from the Republic of South Africa. My client mentioned to me during the break that he was quite taken back by the fact that it was mentioned during the course of these proceedings specifically and at the beginning of the testimony today, because again it creates a negative impression and one draws a negative inference that my client, Neo Solutions, was somehow complicit in the threats or intimidatory tactics leveled against Ms. Tlatsana. So I just wanted to place on record that, and I hope you would agree with me, that there was no association created by the two.
Yeah, not that I've heard of. My understanding is, my impression is that the threats may be related to threats or intimidation that Ms. Tlatsana had given evidence about previously. Now they may or may not be related to her departure from the Republic, may or may not be connected with those about which she gave evidence, but certainly I know nothing and I've heard nothing that would necessarily connect her disappearance to your client.
Thank you.
Chair, if I may.
Yes.
Chair, just to be clear, I understand Mr. Natterson to be quite concerned about the reference to it this morning, as though there's any link to his evidence. I think it's of benefit to the Chair just to explain why it was raised this morning.
Yes.
Chair, today we place before you the full cross-examination application of Mr. Natterson to
Yes.
cross-examine Ms. Tlatsana.
Yes.
If I may be permitted to ask Mr. Natterson whether he doesn't agree that the fact that she might be out of the Republic is relevant to your request to cross-examine her. Do you accept that?
It does affect our ability to cross-examine.
Indeed. Thank you, Chair.
Yes. Yes. No, I think.
I think, Chair, just to clarify why I raised it with my attorney.
Oh, okay. I think maybe let me hear your counsel first. He might say
He might cover me.
He would like you to explain.
Well, I think...
Just
Ms.
wanted to clarify it.
No, Ms. Hofpa actually preempted my second point, which was
Yes.
her absence now makes cross-examination difficult, if not impossible, simply because, as I understand the direction given to us by the Commission, in making our application to cross-examine Ms. Tlatsana, our application was given to her, and the request was made to her by the Commission to submit a further affidavit in reply, and based on that, the Commission would then determine whether or not cross-examination was necessary and to what extent. So it does bring about a question as to how and if and when we are going to be given the opportunity to cross-examine her.
Yes, no, it does raise that question. As things stand on the basis of what we know, and I certainly only heard this morning that apparently she is out of the country. On what we know now, we don't know if and when she may come back to make herself available. But as Ms. Hofmeyer indicated, I think the Commission's investigators are looking into the issue. At some stage in the future, it ought to be possible to reach a conclusion whether she will come back or not. And obviously, that information would be shared with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'm going to get straight into the re-examination or cross-examination of Mr. Natterson.
Yes.
I'm not going to belabor the Commission with detailed references to specific documents,
Yes.
save for one or two
That's fine.
that we need to deal with,
Yes.
because I obviously want to summarize the examination in chief of my learned colleague, and based on that summary, I'll then address Mr. Natterson on various points. Okay.
That's
So
fine.
I'll try and
Yeah.
keep it as concise as possible.
That's fine.
Natterson, I'd like to start with the issue of chartered accountant in business, because it's something that was raised on the 12th of July, beginning of the testimony, and a lot of emphasis was placed on it by the Commission's legal team, and you were asked to make certain concessions, correct?
That's correct.
And you made those concessions. You conceded that you were a chartered accountant in business.
Yes, I
You
do.
conceded that you had read the Code of Good Practice of Chartered Accountants.
Yes,
You conceded that you understood and appreciated the contents of that code.
yes,
Do you agree today, given the advices that you have received subsequent to the 12th of July, as also your own investigations into the matter, as also Mr. Lowenthal's advices to you, that those concessions were incorrect?
those were incorrect.
Correct. Now, much has been made today specifically about the fact that Mr. Lowenthal is not an attorney, you're not an attorney, Mr. Jadil is not an attorney, no one is an attorney. But the one person that is an attorney is my colleague, Ms. Hofmeyer. And she was the one who raised the issue initially and brought the code to your attention. Correct.
Yes,
And the intention behind bringing the code to your attention was to say to you, Mr. Natterson, you're not just a director of Neo Financial Services, you're not just the sole shareholder. You're a chartered accountant in business, and therefore you are held to a higher standard than an ordinary director. Correct.
it's Neo Solutions, not
So
Neo
Neo
Financial.
Solutions.
Yeah.
Correct.
Correct.
Chair, if I may.
Sorry, yes.
Chair, just at the outset, I think it is important to indicate that it is our submission that the scope of re-examination requires non-leading questions to be put to a witness. And my concern at this point, just to put it on record, is that the nature of the questions being put to Mr. Natterson at the moment are leading questions. Thank you, Chair.
Counsel for Mr. Natterson.
This is my understanding of the rules, but I accept what Ms. Hoffmeyer is saying, so I will try and limit my line of questioning to questions which don't lead the witness.
Clarificatory.
Of course.
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Natterson, I'm going to read you a section of the code, and I'd like your comment on it. It says a professional accountant, chartered accountant in business, might be an employee, contractor, partner, director, owner, manager, or volunteer of an employing organization. The legal form of the relationship of the professional accountant with the employing organization has no bearing on the ethical responsibilities placed on the professional accountant. Okay? You've read that.
That's right.
Okay. I'm going to read you section 260.11A1 of the Professional Code. And it says that, and I'm going to go to the relevant portion of the paragraph. It says there is a greater expectation for financial, technological, physical, and intangible resources and on such individuals to take whatever action is appropriate in the public interest to respond to non-compliance or suspected non-compliance other than professional accountants with the employing organization. This is because of senior professional accountants' roles, positions, spheres of influence within the employing organization.
Right.
What do you understand from those two provisions read together in the context of Ms. Hoffmeyer's line of questioning and her assertions to you that you were a chartered accountant in business as opposed to simply the sole director and shareholder of NEO?
I believe I've not been, through your chair, I've not been operating in the capacity as a chartered accountant. I had, to my mind, put in checks and balances in the accounts department and with the external entity in order to provide me the comfort that the books and records are correct and being correctly prepared. So when I signed these financials, there was no inkling at that point in time that I'm signing them off as a chartered accountant. The definition of chartered accountant in business there is something I've now been drawn attention to give it a focus on post the earlier testimony. But as from my recollection, I've got checks and balances, or my understanding was that I had at that point in time in the company, and I made reasonable assumptions that the books and records were accurate as I was signing them off, with adequate controls in place.
So you would disagree then if I said to you, you are held to a higher standard signing off those financials than you would ordinarily be held to if you were the chartered accountant preparing those financials?
Yes, I disagree.
You disagree, okay. And would you agree that in your capacity as director and sole shareholder of NEO, that you aren't engaged by NEO as an employing organization as defined within the code?
I confirm that I'm not.
Okay. So therefore, strictly speaking, those provisions of the code dealing with professional accountants and chartered accountants in business have no application to you?
That's correct, based on reading it like that.
Okay.
Well, the last two were leading, but I'll let go. Let's proceed.
Chair, I disagree with you. I've read the rules very carefully about leading questions.
Let's proceed.
And
it's okay.
let's just proceed, because
Let's
we need to get
proceed,
through this,
yeah.
and I am entitled to re-examine the witness.
Let's proceed.
These are questions that have been put to the witness by the Commission's legal team, and therefore I believe
No,
I am entitled to
you
engage.
must proceed. I was just indicating you have undertaken to
I'm
to
trying
try
to keep it
and-
as concise as possible.
No, I accept that. I accept that.
So, Mr. Knudsen, following on that, okay, if you're not a chartered accountant in business and you were presented with the financials which were prepared by your accountants in conjunction with your accounting staff, and representations were made to you regarding the accuracy of those financial documents, do you see any problem with you being able to sign those documents without having any reference whatsoever to the original books of prime entry, the source documentation, the ledgers, previous financials, any other financial information of the company that would be relevant to the financials that have been drafted and prepared and put before you for signature?
My understanding is that many financial services would have done those steps before I received the financials to sign.
Correct. In fact, it's the obligation of the company to hand over the books of primary entry, the source documents and the like,
Correct.
to the accountants, who then compile the financial information.
That's correct.
Okay, in an accurate way, based on the correct reporting standards. And then, at a later stage, the auditors would come in, if auditors are necessary and warranted in terms of the relevant legislation, and they would then do sampling in order to determine whether or not the accounts that have been prepared were correct. Is that
That's my
correct?
understanding.
Okay. So, do we both, I certainly accept, but do you accept that based on the representations of your accountants and your internal accounting staff, when those financials were put before you, you felt comfortable that they were accurate and that you could sign them?
That's correct, as well as in the context of Patel had given me assurance that he was the watchdog, checking over the work of Ruben.
Yes, you said so. Okay. I'm going to leave the professional chartered accountant and business issue there, simply because I don't believe it warrants any further attention. It's not applicable. Let's just go for a moment to the obligation, statutory obligation, that rests on the company for the purposes of the production and dispatch to third parties of audited financial statements. Are you familiar with Section 30 of the Companies Act, Mr. Knudsen?
Yes,
Are you familiar with the regulations to the Companies Act?
yes,
Okay. Are you aware that based on the turnover of NEO, that it has a status as either a small, medium, or large organization
that's correct.
within the regulations?
That's correct.
Are you, before I ask this question, let me change it, because I know the chair is going to take an issue. Where does NEO rank in that status?
Our current turnovers or turnovers over the periods, the last 4 or 5 years, have been below 50 million.
Below 50 million. So then, having regard to Section 30 of the Companies Act, Regulation 27 thereof, NEO would qualify as a small enterprise, correct?
Small to medium, yeah.
Small
I think
to
below 50, yeah.
And in the circumstances, there's no obligation on the company to produce audited financial statements.
That's correct.
Okay. So the questions that were led by my learned colleague on the 12th of July relating to your obligation in terms of the Companies Act to produce audited financial statements wasn't correct.
That's right.
Okay. Mr. Knudsen, much has been made during the examination in chief of the fact that your various statements furnished to the Commission over the period since the Commission first engaged with you have been, by and large, inconsistent and inaccurate. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. In fact, one of the terms most frequently used by my learned colleague has been, Mr. Knudsen, I refer to your previous testimony. Okay? That's the lead-in to, I refer you to your previous testimony, and I now refer you to a specific statement, and there are inaccuracies and discrepancies, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I'll give you some examples of some of the discrepancies that have been raised by my learned colleague. And these come straight from the Exhibit DD10A, which is the transcription from the last hearing on the 12th of July. Ms. Hofmeyer says, you misled the Commission in your prior submission in that there actually were 3 meetings held with Judil and not 2. You had previously
Chair, if I
signed
may just-
witness statements.
Sorry.
If I may just request a reference so that we can follow.
Page 63, line 15, page
Hang on one second.
Yeah.
Ms. Hofmeyer wants to say something.
Thank you.
Okay.
Chair, I was just requesting our learned friend to give us a reference in the transcript when he refers to it, just so we can pick it up. Chair, you also have a copy of the transcript as well. Thank you.
Oh, I'm not sure that I knew that. Oh, I've got for 12 July.
Indeed.
Yeah, okay, yes.
Chair, as I said to you, I don't want to belabor the Commission with us having to reference specific documentation and specific files again. I think what a better approach would be for Ms. Hofmeyr, if she verily believes that I'm misrepresenting the assertions made by her when I reference them in the transcription, I think she should just say so, and then we can go to those specific.
Yes, I think her request was for you to mention where in the transcript.
I'm more than happy to. It's
Yes.
page 63, line 15, page 67, line 21, page 69, line 20, page 80, line 2. And these are just examples
Yes, okay.
of the alleged inconsistencies that consistently feature in Mr. Natterson's statements.
Yes,
There was no meeting scheduled for the 10th of May between yourself and the Commission. You were made aware of your right to legal representation, and there appear to be multiple versions submitted by you through your engagements with the Commission. So those are just some of the examples of the alleged inconsistencies. And I don't think my learned colleague can dispute the fact that she has on several occasions said to you, with reference to one or more documents, that there are inconsistencies. But the fact of the matter is that these inconsistencies are what we as lawyers would refer to as de minimis. There's nothing material that turns on them. Okay? They are, for example, the issue of the 3 meetings versus 2. Mr. Natterson explained that, yes, he was incorrect in the second statement, and that he had actually forgotten about the previous meeting. But the question is, what relevance and why is it material? Why is that missing meeting material to what the Commission is investigating and what the allegations are that Ms. Hofmeyr is putting forward?
what you may wish to do is see what you wish to put to him, for him to say something, and see what you might wish to reserve for when submissions are made, when you can say no reliance should be placed on this or that or that.
Sure, I'm not making a specific submission on a specific statement. I'm making
Yes.
a general submission
Yes.
as regards to the fact that there have been multiple inconsistencies alleged in various statements submitted by Mr. Natterson. And I don't think anybody here would disagree with me. I think that is common cause. I'm getting to the point that I intend raising.
Yes.
Mr. Natterson, earlier on today, you questioned me, it was actually during the lunch hour, and you asked me where it was, where the line of questioning that was being led by the Commission's legal team was going, what the purpose of it was.
Yeah, I did ask.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I explained to you that because you couldn't understand, and I'm just relaying what, you couldn't understand why time after time inconsistencies had been brought to your attention. And as you quite rightly said, that these were of no consequence. These are immaterial inconsistencies. Where's the Commission going with its questions? And I explained to you that the Commission's investigations have a two-pronged approach. The first is the 204 statement that you gave. Okay?
Yes.
And in that regard, the Commission's assertions, obviously Ms. Hofmeyr hasn't said it expressly, but that's where her line of questioning is going, is that because there are inconsistencies in your statements, and I'm making a put to you, I want you to either agree or disagree. Because there are inconsistencies in your statements, the effect of that is, in terms of Section 204 of the Criminal Procedure Act, is that you haven't given honest and frank testimony. So that's the first part of the 204 attack, for use of a better word. The second is the poker legislation that my learned colleague referred you to, and specifically Section 6 thereof, which, and I'll just read it to you again quickly just so that you jog your memory. Section 6 deals with acquisitions, possessions, or use of proceeds of unlawful activities. And basically what it says is that if you have possession of property and you know or ought reasonably to have known that it forms part of the proceeds of unlawful activities, you're guilty of a criminal offence. Right?
Yes, I recall that.
Okay. So the second pronged attack of 204 is to try and convince, on the evidence, try and convince potentially the authorities that you are guilty not only of the inconsistencies, the misrepresentation, the lack of frankness and honesty in your evidence, but you're also guilty of having used proceeds that you ought to have known or you knew were the proceeds of unlawful activities. Okay, so I'm answering your question now because I'm getting to the very point that we need to touch on. The last prong of the attack is that the 204 statement, and I see that my colleague was belaboring the point this morning, the 204 statement itself hasn't been validly taken, and therefore it's legally unenforceable. Okay? So we have effectively a three-pronged approach. We've got the lack of frankness and honesty because of your inconsistent statements. We've got the fact that the 204 is not a legally viable document because it wasn't taken by a properly authorized person in the correct manner. And lastly, you're in violation of the poker legislation because you had use of the 9.9 million and therefore you are guilty of a criminal offense. So we have to deal with these in cross-examination because they are obviously very material issues and obviously affect how this matter proceeds. Mr. Nutterson, let's just deal with the inconsistencies as a starting point. Would you agree with the submission that the inconsistencies to date that have been raised with you are immaterial and irrelevant to the...
That's quite leading.
Chair, this is the third time we've touched on the issue of the leading questions. I'm asking Mr. Nutterson whether he believes, in his opinion, not asking for a qualified, I'm asking for his subjective opinion, whether he believes that the inconsistencies that have been raised by my learned colleague in his various statements are of a material nature or not. It's a very simple question. It's not a legal question. It's not a question that requires a chartered accountant in business to answer. It's a simple question based on subjectivity. I don't think it's a leading question.
Maybe I can respond.
Yes.
When I was first contacted by the Commission, I went in using the 204, which was already issued in October of 2017. So when I was contacted, I actually went to them with the evidence at that point in time. The further evidence I had was the recording, which the DCPI Hawks did not have. So when I took the recording, I contacted UDEAL and said, do you want this recording because it actually proves totally clearly that I was not aware that this was SA Express's money. And they said, no, they had what they needed, and he doesn't believe I need it. If they wanted it, they will ask for it. So in March of this year, when I was contacted by the Commission, I went to them with the investigating team with exactly that, thinking that, okay, this is already a matter that's sitting at the Hawks. They're probably needing the evidence to go into the state capture process to see whether it can flow any further. That was my understanding when I started the process. Then more and more questions started to come. Now remember at the time when this was brought to my attention by UDEAL, then I said, here's all the information. Then he assisted me in preparing the affidavit. If the affidavit is scant or doesn't reflect every single point, my understanding now, as the Commission's investigators pick up more and more, they're looking for more clarity. So everything that has been provided to date is to provide that clarity that is being sought at each point in time. So to me, yes, if there's something I had not known at that point in time that I pick up now that the information is different, as I pick it up, I share that. So it's not, the inconsistencies should not be considered as misrepresentations. The inconsistencies are because it appears that the Commission is requiring a much further level of detail than we had 3 years ago when this matter came about. And that's really how it's evolved from there.
Thanks, Mr. Nutterson. I think that quite succinctly answers the majority of that question. But the fact of the matter is that your various statements are very consistent throughout. The thread of the statements is by and large identical throughout all the statements. The only thing that differs is the additional information that's provided. And as you've just quite rightly said, And that happens through specific context where specific information is sought. And in effect, you then supplement the statements as you go along. But supplementation doesn't equate to inconsistency. Would you agree with that?
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Nuttison, insofar as, and we're going to go into this in a lot more detail, but insofar as your knowledge as regards the unlawfulness of the funds that you had in your account that flowed from Coroneka into Neo Solutions account, you've already testified, and I'm just confirming this, that you had no knowledge as to the unlawfulness of the source of those funds. Is that correct?
At the time, definitely not.
At the time, definitely not. And in the circumstances and in terms of the requisite legislation, and specifically POCA, to which my learned colleague referred, there has to be intent. You had to have known of the unlawfulness in order to violate that legislative provision. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay. And because you had no knowledge, there was no violation, correct?
that's my understanding.
Correct. Okay. Ms. Knudsen, let's just deal with the 204 affidavit. You gave testimony this morning that the affidavit was prepared by Mr. Judil and that he presented it to you and that he in effect did that with Ms. Mokotsi on the phone, and that pursuant to that statement having been prepared, you then deposed to it and it was submitted. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. The 204 itself, Mr. Nuttison, as you quite rightly pointed out earlier, is a standard form affidavit, say for the content that you include or incorporate. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so.
So reference to the specific sections of the Act and your obligation to lodge criminal complaints is something that, and I know you said you weren't familiar with 204s, but would you appreciate that that's part of the legislation and has to be incorporated
as a standard clause.
by implication into that affidavit? Correct.
That's correct, yeah.
So when my learned colleague questioned you on that and asked you whether or not you had read that provision and whether or not you had taken the necessary steps, how would you respond to that, just to be clear?
Well, as I said at the time, I had spoken to Udil, and Udil said that the matter was already under a case number at the commercial crime unit, so therefore there was no need to do any further reporting. All they would do is append it to the existing case file. That was my understanding from Udil at the time.
Okay, so as far as you're concerned, the affidavit, the 204, was taken legally, given the fact that Mr. Udil represented that he was a private investigator, correct?
Yes,
And that he was working with the DPCI.
that's correct.
And that he had been tasked by the relevant person, Ms. Mkhotsi, in securing the 204 affidavit.
That's
And
correct.
you then were privy to a conversation, although you didn't hear the exact exchange, you were privy to the conversation, understood from that Ms. Mkhotsi had directed Mr. Judil to take the 204 affidavit under oath from you.
That's correct.
Okay. So as far as you were concerned at the time, in giving the 204 was taken by a legally authorized person,
That was my understanding at the time.
and that the 204 was binding on you.
That's correct.
Okay. And the contents of the 204 would, in your submission, and let's take into account the allegations by my learned colleague that there are inconsistencies, would you say that the 204 accords with the various other statements that you've submitted to the Commission to date?
It still does.
Still does.
In my view, it still does.
Is there any respect in which you believe it digresses or diverges from those statements?
Well, I don't believe there's inaccuracies. The monies that were received were validly paid back to him. The accounting for the 300,000 is what our advocate Hofmeyer has disputed, but I've explained that. It was placed in there to account for the full 9.9 million.
Okay. So I think we'll leave the 204 there. My point was simply that as far as you were concerned, you verily believed that the 204 subpoena was being taken by a legally authorized representative, that it contained the necessary legislative prerequisites, and that it was legally binding on you.
That's correct.
Okay. Would you submit that to date, from inception of this matter, in other words, when the Commission first contacted you, till today, that you have given frank and honest testimony to this Commission?
Yes.
Is there any aspect of your testimony to date, say for where you have belabored under the misconception, for example, with the chartered accountant in business, that you were obligated to comply with the code, which you weren't? Is there any other instance where you believe that your testimony has not been frank and honest?
No.
Okay. So you believe that you've complied with the provisions of Section 204 of the Criminal Procedure Act?
Yes.
You believe that the protection afforded by 204 should be afforded to you in the circumstances?
Yes.
Okay. Is there any reason you believe that the 204 protection shouldn't be afforded to you?
No.
Mr. Nuttison, let's then move on to, so we've dealt with your knowledge as regards the unlawfulness of the funds, we've dealt with the validity and enforceability of the 204, and we've dealt with the inconsistencies and your honest and frank testimony, okay? Which is, as I said earlier, the thrust of the attack or approach taken by the Commission in its line of questioning. That's where they were attempting to get to. The problem for the Commission thus far, though, if I may submit, and I'm not going to make it your submission, is that there isn't any hard and fast evidence which makes you complicit in any of the alleged criminal activities which you are accused. Okay? You were unwittingly the victim, or Nia was unwittingly the victim of money laundering activities. Would you agree with that?
With what we know now,
I don't want to
yes.
put words into your mouth, but this is the testimony that's been given today. You would agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. At the time of receiving the funds, you had no knowledge that the funds were unlawful or that they'd come from a state organization?
Definitely not.
Had you known, what would you have done?
I wouldn't have followed through on any of that transaction had I known
Okay.
that it was from a state enterprise.
Would you have brought it to Mr. Van Wyck's attention immediately?
Yes.
Were you surprised by Mr. Tlatsana's original affidavit implicating you?
Well, I was aware of the 204 already, so at that point in time, at the point of the 204 is when I was aware that the funds were not it came from a government.
But were you
source.
surprised that Ms. Tlatsana had come on record and accused you of being involved in these activities?
Well, I wasn't aware of Tlatsana's name until UDL approached me for the 204. Before that, I was just aware that Van Wyk had a partner. And I was aware that there was a dispute with the partner that he was going to retrieve the control over the bank accounts.
And for the record, you had no direct dealings with Tlatsana?
I'd never heard the name Tlatsana until much later.
And for the record, there was no invoicing activities between Coroneka and Nia?
Definitely not.
Okay. Had there been invoices, I think would your internal accounting staff have raised it with you?
Well, Brian worked closely with them, but from what I understand, there should not have been any invoices because this was not related to an invoice-based transaction.
So you stand by your advices in the 204,
Yes?
and just to go back to your point on supplementation of the statements as things progressed through to where they are now, at each and every stage, all of your affidavits were deposed to on the basis that the information contained in those statements was to the best of your knowledge and belief at the time of making those statements correct.
That's right.
Okay. What do you understand by to the best of your knowledge and belief at the time?
It's what I know as either the facts or what I can draw inferences on as existing at that point in time.
Does that knowledge and belief change at all at any time?
No, not around whether the source of funds, definitely not.
No, but I'm saying in the context of the various statements as
No.
they progressed, your knowledge and belief, I'm assuming it changed as
Well,
circumstances.
as more information comes to light, we then obviously supplemented the documentation.
So if there were investigations conducted, if meetings transpired, if conversations were had with third parties, like Mr. Ujil, with the Commission, with your legal representatives, based on those interactions, your statements would have changed over time, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So when one deposes to an affidavit on the basis that, to the best of your knowledge and belief, the facts therein contained are correct, true and correct,
That's right.
is it correct that your understanding is based on your knowledge and belief at that time of making the statement? What's in that statement is correct, but that it can change over time?
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Nutterson, if we can move on to the receipt of these funds from Mr. Van Wyk and the due diligence that was conducted by you. Now, I suspect, but I'm not going to make it my personal submission, but I suspect that part of the Chartered Accountant in Business relates to the higher standard that was expected of you by the Commission when accepting these funds from Mr. Van Wyk, because much was made of the fact that your due diligence, if I can put it that way, on Mr. Van Wyk was less than would have been expected by the Commission. And there was argument made or questions that were put to you regarding the fact that Mr. Van Wyk mentioned that he did not wish to have a lifestyle audit. And in fact, the inquiry actually went around in circles for quite some time on this very point. And I just want to clarify it because it's obviously highly material to whether you ought to have known, as the poker legislation requires, that the proceeds were from an unlawful source. So let's just, as my colleague likes to say, let's just unpack this a little. Let's start with the requirement for lifestyle audits. Are lifestyle audits a regular occurrence in the public sector?
My understanding is that they are,
Why,
especially on state-owned entities.
and why? What would you believe the reason for that to be?
It's to identify whether there's sources of income that obviously from state monies that may have ended up in the hands of officials.
Okay. So it's not untoward for a state official in any capacity to have a lifestyle audit conducted on them.
No, it's not unusual. I saw them as a regular occurrence. not a
And it
unique-
doesn't have to be suspicion of any unlawfulness. It's often done on the basis that it's practice.
Correct.
Okay. And Mr. Nutson, in terms of SARS, you mentioned earlier ADR and money and the fact that you've had to deal with SARS on various occasions. As far as you're aware, does SARS conduct lifestyle audits?
My understanding is that they do look at your asset base and your lifestyle against the income you're declaring.
Isn't it almost common practice for lifestyle audits to be conducted every time there's an audit of a taxpayer?
I think they
Income tax?
reconcile the assets or the movement in assets to.
So
the
why
income
then
tax.
do you believe that the Commission was so focused on the issue of lifestyle audit when you mentioned that in passing, Mr. Van Wyk had said he didn't really want a lifestyle audit? Why do you think that the Commission's legal team focused on that issue so much?
My understanding at the time was that.
No, I don't think that is helpful. You need to ask him a question that will focus on clarifying whatever answer he may have given in regard to that question.
Okay, Chair. Do you believe that it was your obligation as a businessman, not a chartered accountant, because you weren't conducting yourself as a chartered accountant in business or otherwise within NEO. You were simply a director and a shareholder, and as you said, quite heavily involved in projects. And a business opportunity had arisen with Mr. Van Wyk. Do you think you were obligated in the circumstances to interrogate him on his comment in passing regarding lifestyle audit?
I felt it was a regular occurrence, so he mentioned it in passing. That's why I didn't take it further. It wasn't a specific forensic audit that was being conducted against him, from my understanding.
And am I correct in, if I remember your testimony, the lifestyle audit comment made in passing was in relation to the fact that the reason for him wanting to pay the funds to Neo was that he didn't want a lifestyle audit on his personal accounts and affairs. Is that correct?
My understanding was they would, if there was a regular lifestyle audit, then this was income that he was deriving from private business, and he was already planning to leave SA Express anyway, so he felt he didn't want it on accruing to him at that point in time.
So you saw nothing untoward about the comment that he made in passing
No.
with regards to lifestyle audits?
No, I relied on the undertakings that he gave me that it was definitely not state money.
Yes. Would it be a correct submission to say that no one wants a lifestyle audit?
Yeah, that's a fair comment.
Okay. Why do you think it's a fair comment?
Everyone believes that a lifestyle audit in some sort will look to find something at some point in time. So it's, by nature, it's a negative thing. It's like having to collect on insurance or pay insurance.
Correct. Okay. And given the fact that the amount that was going to be transferred was a substantial amount, 9.9 million, did you believe that that in itself warranted further investigation?
Not at all. I mean, the farming deal was going to be obviously much bigger than that, and he was actually showing credibility. He always purported he was a successful businessman before he went to SA Express, that he came from private sector first. So I had no question that he had the money and the assets to be able to come up with his share of the money to invest in the farming enterprise.
Mr. Natterson, is NEO a accountable institution?
No.
In terms of the relevant legislation, FICA legislation?
FICA, no, definitely not.
Are you an accountable person in terms of that legislation?
No.
Ms. Natterson, I'm going to put a number of requirements to you. Not really requirements. I'm going to run off a list of accountable organizations or institutions per the legislation. I'm going to ask whether NEO or yourself, because it refers to person or organization, falls within any of these categories. And I just want you to say yes or no. A practitioner who practices is defined in Section 1 of the Attorneys Act.
No.
Okay. A board of executors or trust company or other person that invests, keeps in safe custody, controls or administers trust property within the meaning of the Trust Property Control Act.
No.
An estate agent is defined in the Estate Agency Affairs Act.
No.
An authorized user of exchange as defined in the Security Services Act.
No.
A manager registered in terms of the Collective Investment Schemes Control Act.
No.
A person who carries on the business of a bank is defined in the Banks Act.
No.
A mutual bank is defined in the Mutual Banks Act.
No.
A person who carries on long-term insurance business is defined as Long-Term Insurance Act.
No.
A person who carries on the business of making available a gambling activity as contemplated in Section 3 of the National Gambling Legislation.
No.
A person who carries on the business of dealing in foreign exchange.
No.
A person who carries on the business of lending money against securities, security of securities.
No.
A person who carries on the business of financial service provider requiring authorization in terms of the Financial Advisory and Intermediary Services Act.
No.
A person who issues, sells, or redeems travelers' checks.
No.
Post Bank referred to in Section 51 of the Postal Services Act.
No.
The Ataba Development Finance Corporation Limited. A person who carries on the business of a money remitter.
No.
Okay. So you don't, as either a person or an organization, NEO being an organization, fall within the ambit of the Act as an accountable institution, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so is there any obligation you know of that requires you, as a business person, entering into a business-related transaction with a third party at arm's length to identify and verify the transaction?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. So, I mean, would you agree that no business in this country could really be conducted if every single time money exchanged hands for the purposes of a potential business transaction, if there was a requirement to identify and verify and effectively FICA the party you were dealing with? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it would be a huge
In the context of that, do you believe that you took reasonable steps in your due diligence investigation of Mr. Van Wyk?
At that point in time, I believe I did.
At that point in time, you did. He was a friend of yours?
Yes.
Okay. You were aware of his background based on what he had informed you of?
Yeah.
You trusted him?
Yes, he was, as I said, I dropped my guard because he was a friend.
Yes. Did you have even any reason not to trust him, Mr. Knudsen?
No, there was nothing that came across that would lead me to question that he's done anything wrong.
No third party said something to you about Mr. Van Wyk and said, you better be careful of this man?
No.
Any circumstances that occurred that gave rise to any concern whatsoever on your part?
No.
The fact that he was involved in state employment, and the fact that he was an employee of the state?
That's why my concern came about, for him to give undertakings that it was not money from
Okay, so
government.
that was the only concern you had.
That was the only concern.
And just again, tell us why that was a concern of yours.
Obviously, if it was state-related, I would have no part of it. So from my perspective, he gave undertakings. It was private. He was wanting to come into farming venture. He was obviously wanting to leave SA Express. He told us June 2016 was the date that he was going to leave, and that's what I worked off.
So you had no reason whatsoever to believe that there was anything untoward with regards to Mr. Van Wyk or his proposition that he enter into a farming venture with you and that he capitalized Neo Solutions for that purpose.
There was none at the time.
And when I say Neo, I mean obviously there was going to be an
And
incorporated entity called Distal that was going to be set up for the venture once it materialized, as I understood your testimony.
That's
But
right.
until then it was a capitalization of Neo.
That's right.
And there was mass confusion this morning about the application of the 300,000 and how it had been dealt with in the banking accounts. And let's just revisit that quickly because it really isn't complicated. So I just want to set the record straight. You had sold a vehicle, 1.4 million, if I recall correctly, had was financed, and the other 300 was paid in cash.
That's right.
You
yeah.
were sitting with 300,000 rand in your safe at home, correct?
Yes.
And that Mr. Van Wyk had asked for those monies to be paid out to him. You had them available. You paid them out.
That's right.
Why weren't you concerned by his request for the payment of the 300,000, given the fact that he had, as Ms. Hofmeyer put it, already requested repayment of certain other funds which he had received? Why were you not concerned about the 300,000 rand cash request?
We had known about his passion for the cars, and he had indicated previously he was intending to buy a 1984, I recall at the time, earlier. So I assumed when he called me that he was trying to purchase the same or an equivalent vehicle. It's because the 300,000 sort of resonated in my head from earlier discussions.
Does it matter whether it was for a vehicle or not? If he asked you for 300,000 and you were willing to
If I
provide
hadn't,
that
then I
money
was
to
given
him,
it,
does
yes.
it matter what the underlying causa was?
No, not at all. He was a
I don't
friend as
believe
well,
it
so I
does.
assumed he was
Yeah.
wanting to buy it, and he would obviously, I was sitting with funds of his anyway that he was entitled to it.
I guess the only reason that my learned colleague raised issue with the 300,000 rand was because it formed part of the 9.9 million ultimately
Yes.
that flowed into Neo, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
If I didn't have the 300,000, I would have then said I would EFT another 300, and he would have to make a plan to purchase the vehicle himself.
Yes.
But because it was on hand, it was given to him.
And because 300 was still outstanding to him or his
Correct.
nominated entity in respect of the repayment of the 9.9.
That's correct.
Okay. And much has been made about the overdraft facilities and the fact that, and let me just diverge for a second, the fact that there was provision in the overdraft facility contract dealing with the obligation to provide audited financial statements. We've dealt with that. You said that the bank never asked for it. It wasn't the bank's practice. And now we know in terms of the relevant legislation that it wasn't even necessary. So let's leave that aside. And even if the bank had asked for it, you could say to the bank, actually, let me qualify. No obligation exists on me in legislation to provide the audited financial statements. And whilst it might be a provision of this contract, I could take legitimate issue with it. Right? Let's just leave that for a second. I want to go back to the overdraft facility. Much has been made about the 300,000 and how Mr. Rubin accounted for it in the books of account of Neo Solutions, and the fact that there's a notation on the banking account that says Neo Solution loan. Let's just delve into that again, because it really isn't complicated, but there seems to be mass confusion between loan, the word loan, the concept of a liability in the financial sense, and the concept of a loan account in the financial sense. Do you understand that a loan account is not actually a banking account, Mr. Nuttison?
Yes, yes.
You understand
It's
that
a
it's
general
actually a
ledger
financial
item.
obligation raised in the books of account of a company?
That's right.
Okay, and that it could either be a debit loan account or credit loan account?
Yeah, either two are from the company.
And you understand that the reason that Mr. Rubin, in his wisdom, which we now know was actually fraudulent conduct, in his wisdom decided to apply it in the way he did, was because in his mind he was accounting for the money that was...
He was keeping track of that record.
He was keeping track, and he wanted to make sure that whatever money was indebted to Van Wyk or his nominees was repaid in full.
Correct.
Okay. So do you see any inconsistency in the statement and reference to the 300,000? Is there anything that sparks inconsistency in your mind?
No.
Nothing. Okay. Mr. Nuttison, before we leave the issue of the 300,000, let's just delve into it a bit further. Just for the sake of my colleague, because it was, as Mr. Lowenthal, we'll get to his affidavit a bit later, it was an interest-free loan. This is how it was corrected. It was
The
provision
entire
was...
9.9 million.
Sorry?
No.
No, we're talking about we're talking about the money that is still to be paid, or tendered to the relevant party in respect of the benefit received. That was applied as an interest-free loan, but the reason I mention it now is because we're dealing with the overdraft facility, the loan accounts, the issue of a loan as a liability. We're just trying to distinguish these concepts so that there's no confusion on the part of the Commission's legal team. But this is how we got back into it. Ms. Hofmeyr said, but she was using the analogy of a loan from a bank. And she said, but no bank would charge, would give you an interest-free loan. And you conceded that, right? And you said, but that was very different because that's liability. That's an actual loan. And then I actually jumped up and I said, well, actually, it depends on the intention with which the monies are advanced and the nature of the money so advanced. That determines how you deal with it from an accounting perspective, correct?
Correct.
Okay. We'll get to Mr. Lowenthal's affidavit shortly, and I'll just take you through those provisions again, and we'll decide whether or not the accounting for those monies has been done correctly, because I know that was in the last part of the examination in chief, that was a large part of the discrepancy that was raised. So we dealt with the 300,000. You know, again, the causa for the 300,000 really is of no consequence. Mr. Van Wyk asked you for the 300,000. Monies were still due to him, and you paid it out of your personal funds. And
please, don't make a speech to the witness. Put questions to the witness.
Chair, I'm entitled, with all due respect.
You're not entitled to make a speech.
Chair, I'm not making a speech. I'm entitled.
Please put questions to the witness.
Chair, I'm entitled to reiterate the evidence that was given this morning, leading to a question. I'm entitled to. I'm sorry, I disagree with you.
You're entitled to do that.
I disagree with you. I'm not making a speech. Trust me, if I make a speech, you will know I'm not making a speech.
Please, okay, let's try again.
Let's try again, Mr. Nuttison.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry I was reiterating the evidence already given. I apologize. Mr. Nuttison, the issue of the 300,000, because I really just don't understand the issue with the 300,000. Am I correct in saying that 300,000 was still owing to Mr. Van Wyk pursuant to the repayment of the 9.9?
Still owing to Van Wyk? No.
After advance of the other monies.
So he had been paid 7 back during December. So there was still, in January, there was still 2.9.
Okay, so there was still money owing to him.
There was still money, yes.
Okay, so when you advanced the 300,000, it was your understanding, as you said this morning, but I won't reiterate this morning's testimony, that money was still owing to him. You would advance it personally from the money that you had in your safe, and that the company would then account for it.
That's correct.
Okay. Is there anything untoward regarding a transaction of that nature in your...
In my mind, no, because the contra entry in the books of account went through my shareholder loan account. So it was taken off what was owing to Van Wyk and put it into my side.
I mean, I often pay for expenses on behalf of my firm, and it goes straight to my loan account. So I don't understand the issue with it, but maybe I'm just incorrect. Mr. Nuttison, The accounting of that money at the time was done by who? The accounting for that money was done
by
by who?
Ruben.
By Ruben. And who was Mr. Ruben? Let's just
He
understand
was the
who
internal
exactly
accountant
he was.
at the office.
He was an accountant.
Yes,
Was he a contractor or an employee?
he's an employee.
He was an employee. So he was under your direct control and supervision.
That's right.
Did you direct and control how he administered the accounts?
No, he was working with the external accountants in terms of the chart of accounts, how the trial balance was laid out. Because of previous errors during the SARS process, the entire chart of accounts for 2015 onwards was to be remapped to be able to give effect to better bookkeeping. So he was working with them in terms of putting that together.
But my
and
question to
accounting
you
for the
was,
entries.
my question to you was, did he perform his duties under your direct control and supervision?
Yes, he reported to me in the company.
But did you give him instruction on how his accounting function should be rendered?
No.
Okay, so you didn't tell him 300,000 was paid by me in cash to Mr. Van Wyck's driver or to Mr. Van Wyk, and I want you to account for it in the books of account of NEO in the following way.
No, I said to him, please make sure you make a note of it so that we don't overpay him from the 9.9 back.
Okay.
He must take a note that
So you
this
weren't
300
giving specific direction as to how accounting entries were made in the books of account of NEO?
No.
Okay. Mr. Knudsen, the issue of benefit has been bandied about backwards and forwards since this inquiry started. And I've explained in the simplest of terms why benefit is so important to the Commission, because if they can show that you've benefited, if you had use in terms of the poker legislation, if you had use of these illicit funds, and you knew or you ought to have known that they were from an unlawful source, then you are immediately guilty of an offence. Correct?
Correct.
Okay. So a lot has been made about you having utilized the funds that you received. And another misconception that arose this morning was the fact that because the funds were integrated, for use of a better word, into the overdraft funds, that the company in effect had use of those funds.
Yes.
That's the submission that's been made. Mr. Knudsen, to be clear on that point, we again went back to the concepts, which are critical in this issue of unlawful proceeds or unlawful funds, source of funds. Intention versus nature. Okay? Did you intend for the funds to be utilized as part of your cash flow?
No.
Okay. Did you intend for those funds to support the business operations of Neo Solutions?
No.
Did you intend for the funding to be specifically incorporated into the overdraft funds as opposed to being ring-fenced in a separate account?
No.
Was it your intention to have any use or benefit from those funds?
No.
You've conceded to the Commission's legal team that, and you've conceded it in your most recent statements, that you in fact did derive benefit from the funds that were received?
Yes.
Okay. And who advised you that you had received benefit?
I think post the earlier testimony, when we saw that the discussion of benefit was coming about, then we sat between our own legal team and obviously the external advisor, Lowenthal, is when we established that there's an inadvertent benefit that had been derived.
An indirect benefit.
An indirect benefit.
So, in other words, it wasn't intended. It was something
It was
that arose.
definitely not intended.
Okay. So the funds were received. They were meant to be capitalized into the company for the purposes of the farming venture, correct?
Into a separate company, yeah.
Into a separate company ultimately, but initially they went into NEO.
That's right.
And there was commixio with the funds in the overdraft facility. Everything was intertwined and intermingled. And as a result, the interest that would have accrued to the overdraft facility was less than it would have been had those funds not been intermingled or intertwined with the funds in the overdraft facility.
That's correct.
Is my understanding correct?
That's correct.
And that's the benefit that was derived.
The indirect
Because
benefit.
besides the benefit, there was another benefit that my learned colleague raised this morning, I think regarding transactional charges and
A setup fee.
setup fees, that's correct. Okay. But those were all, you would agree, unintended benefits
Correct.
and unintended usage.
That's right.
When you took the money from Mr. Van Wyk, did you ever contemplate that you would use those for funding the operations of NEO,
No, no,
for the transactional charges on the account,
no.
for any benefit whatsoever to NEO Solutions, say for the ultimate onward capital investment in Distal and the farming operations?
The intention was to move it to Distal for the farming.
Okay. So in accepting the funds, you saw no benefit at the time, save for the fact that it was an agreement between you and Mr. Van Wyk that those funds would be paid over.
That's correct.
Okay. Let's just deal with, we've obviously, there's been a substantive amount of testimony regarding how the funds were paid over, the way they were channeled, conduit through Coroneka, the repayment to Batsamai. This is all a matter of record, and I don't, again, want to belabor the Commission. But let's just focus quickly on, and I'm going to get to the repayment of the funds because it's quite important. But let's just focus on, again, before we leave this point behind, the knowledge you had with regards to the source of the funds and the fact that they were illegal. You testified this morning that during May you had a conversation with Mr. Van Wyk. He had phoned you, and
May 2018.
May 2018, sorry, and you had recorded the conversation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You are entitled to record the conversation in terms of the RICA legislation? Yes, no?
Yes, I felt I did. It was to corroborate that the fact that
You were a party to the conversation.
That's right.
Therefore, in terms of Section 5 of the RICA legislation, you're entitled to record it. Correct.
Correct.
So there's nothing untoward about that. And
Yeah.
why did you record it? Just for the sake of completeness.
I had not engaged with Van Wyk since late or mid to late 2017. So, and by then I'd already issued the Section 204 through UDeal. So the fact that he called me out of the blue, I just landed back in Johannesburg from a trip. He called me as I was on the bus being ferried from the plane to the terminal. So I told him I'll call him back from the car. When I got into the car, I recorded the conversation from my second phone whilst the conversation was on my speakerphone.
Chair, we did discuss this morning the possibility of playing the recording that Mr. Nutterson took of his conversation with Mr. Van Wyk. It's critical. It's critical to whether or not Mr. Nutterson had knowledge of the unlawfulness of the funds or the source of the funds. So if you would indulge me, Chair, we've already made arrangements with your audiovisual staff.
How long is it? Duration?
It's 10 minutes, Chair.
Okay, that's fine. Ms. Hofmeyer, you know about it.
Indeed, Chair.
Yes.
There is a full transcript of it in the...
There is a transcript.
There is, indeed. But I understand Mr. Pinaar
Yes.
to want to play it, and I've no objection if it
Yes,
takes
no,
10 minutes.
that's in order.
There's certain nuances that are lost if one just reads the transcription.
No, that's fine.
It's so much better to actually listen.
That's fine. Do you propose that we listen to it until it finishes, or do you propose to stop in between?
Chair, should we listen till it's finished and then maybe take a
that's
break?
fine. Yeah, that's fine.
I don't know if you're aware that what's his name? Jan works for that lady that I was going against.
He didn't tell me that he's working for her. He told me that he was, you know, when she opened your counter case against you. Hello?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah, he said
Can you hear me?
that when she opened the, the counter charges against you, then he had to collaborate with or cooperate with the prosecutor. That's the last thing he told me. That she had opened a counter case and then he had to give the file.
Sorry.
Hello?
Okay. Did he obtain? Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Did he obtain a Section 204 affidavit from you?
Yeah, so what he said was the prosecutor wanted, obviously, because we had channeled the payment, the stuff that I paid through for you.
Yeah.
He said he wanted a statement from me because otherwise they were going to charge me. So I said, yeah, but I did everything cleanly, and I was told by you that it was clean, and nothing untoward in what I did.
So Jan and this lady have taken the information to the media.
To the media?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So what's happening now?
The story is going to run in the media tomorrow.
As what? What's it saying?
It says that the Northwest officials were involved in some sort of case with people at SA Express, and
but this transaction wasn't related to SA Express, was it?
No. But let me tell you what the problem is now.
Yeah.
Your name might appear in I'm not sure yet, I will know in the next hour, might appear in that article, because you're being cited as a state witness.
But Brian, when you asked me to help you out with this, you told me that it wasn't related to your work at SA Express. So what's this transaction related to?
So
I thought it was a Northwest project. It wasn't an SA Express project, right?
Now I don't know what Jan and this woman have cooked up. I'm going to find out and I will come back to you.
Yeah, please, because from what I understood, remember,
because I don't. But Vivian, sorry. One, I'm apologizing for getting into the situation, but more importantly, I did not know that Jan is going to do this, and he's gone ahead and done this.
So what, has he changed sides? Is that what you are saying? Because he was representing you, so...
No, he has changed sides.
Remember, you had appointed him, right, to deal with this fraud? Because you said that the lady had stolen the...
And Jan is telling me that he had a fallout with Willa, and he had a fallout with you, so...
He didn't have a fallout. He came to me and he said, this is what's going on. And that the prosecutor, because she had done a counter case. So when he came to me, he was getting evidence in order to deal with a counter case.
Yes, and he's since then used that to put that in the media with this lady. Because he's cited as the source with this lady. And the main thing they're saying, the allegation is that you were the conduit for the funds, etc. Now, I responded via lawyers this afternoon. We cannot say such things. But yeah, this is the extent. I'm very disappointed, but it is what it is.
No, but wait, hang on, you've lost me now, right? When I helped you with this, you told me it wasn't related to an SA Express thing at all. So what does it relate to? It was a Northwest project, you told me, right?
Yes.
But it had nothing to do with SA Express?
No.
Okay. So then what's the problem? Why would they... ultimately, there's nothing wrong with the transaction there, because you are retrieving your money from her.
So, like I said, I'm not aware of what's in the truth. I'm not aware of what Jan has put forward and what Jan has given to them. But I'm just...
See, all they took from me was the proof of what came in and the proof of what went out. That's all they took, and I put an affidavit that says that.
Yeah.
So, and I said unconditionally that it wasn't related to, as far as I'm aware, it wasn't related to anything related to your employment.
It wasn't related, so it wasn't related. Now, obviously, Jan has gone and changed everything, and it's I don't know. I'll find out later today, and I'll find out tomorrow exactly the extent of the information shared by Jan and what the allegations are, because it obviously, one, we don't want it to spread We don't want it to turn into something it's not. But I don't know what to say about Jan. I
haven't.
Where is Willa?
Villa's also disappeared on me, so I've not spoken to Villa. Well, I actually spoke to him yesterday for the first time in like 5 months, but related to one of the Bucky. He's got my company, Bucky. So all I wanted was the company Bucky because I need to deploy it to a project. But he hasn't been around since December with us. He's been doing his own thing.
Yeah. Okay, because when I called Jan and I asked him, Jan, I'm hearing this, there's a media inquiry, what's the story? He said, yeah, whatever needs to be exposed must be exposed. If it goes out, it goes out.
But why did this project go so far? I mean, you had a valid case. The last time you had a court order to freeze the accounts, and you were doing a settlement. That's the last discussion that I was involved in, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
then he said to me that this was like around February. He said to me that she had opened a counterclaim. So all he wanted was evidence that the money came to me and I paid it out because my name is clear. That's what he said to me. So I said cool, and I gave the affidavit that proved it.
And did he say that he would use that in the media?
No, not at all. I told him for a fact that I did nothing wrong. So why would my name?
And the last thing we want is your name in the media.
Exactly. Yeah. Why would I? I mean, I didn't even benefit from this thing. Remember, it was a project that I helped you out with.
Oh, I really don't know what the story is with. So anyway, I was just making you aware because you mustn't think. And he categorically told me, no, you don't need to contact Vivian. He's going through a lot at the moment. So clearly, somebody was being played, whilst somebody was giving whatever they would imagine would be evidence to try and use and leverage with their client.
Yeah, you just be careful that you're not used as a pawn. If this was a clean transaction, then why is it a problem? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I don't understand why it's gone off the rails. You had a valid case against her from what you told me.
Yes. I'm just... but also, remember, because he now works for her, and the excuse is always, no, don't worry, I work for both sides. I mean... No,
you can't work for both sides. The last he was involved with was where you mandated him to assist with the settlement. Remember that?
Yeah. And now he then goes and does this, but more importantly, he's just... I don't know if Jan knows what he is doing by implicating people that should not be implicated or that have done nothing wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's pure allegations. It's pure allegations and it's quite reckless. And I mean, he was telling me, he says he doesn't care. And I said to him, but yeah, how could you do this? And he says, no, my relationship with you ended in December, and I told you that I've had a fallout with Willa. And
but that's irrelevant. The point is you remunerated him to do a task. So ethically, he must represent you, and he can't now go and represent the other side. That's not allowed.
Yeah. That legally will be contested. Yeah, I'm not too worried about that. Yeah. I'm not too worried about that. We'll manage his ethics and his thing via that.
But Brian, this was not a state transaction, right? This was work that there was a private company involved. That's what you told me.
Yes. And I'll come and see you. I don't know where you are. Maybe tomorrow or the next day. I'll come and see you. And
I'm in Joburg for the rest of the week, so I'll be around.
Okay. All right. Perfect.
Okay.
All right.
Sure.
Thanks so much.
Right.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay.
Chair, it's 5 to 4.
Yes.
If you indulge me for 5 more minutes, I can finish this aspect off.
Yes, if you'll be able to finish that
questions.
aspect, that's fine. Let's finish that aspect.
Mr. Knudsen, if I go to the transcript of that conversation that we've just heard with Mr. Van Wyk and yourself, which appears at VN 238.174, and we go to, and you'll see there's paragraph numbering on the side, and we go to paragraph 10. You say, then he said he wanted a statement from me because otherwise they were going to charge me. So I said, but yeah, everything sorry, I did everything cleanly, and I was told by you that it was clean. Okay, so you say that.
Yes, I did.
Again, at paragraph on the next page, continuation of paragraph 20. So let's just read from the bottom. But this transaction was not related to SA Express, was it?
Yes.
That's what you say. Mr. Van Wyk responds, no, 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 no. But let me tell you what the problem is now. Then he goes on to say your name might be appearing in an article. Then again, at paragraph 10 on the same page, I thought it was a Northwest project. It was not an SA Express project. Right, question mark. Mr. Van Wyk, no. I do not know what Jan and this woman have cooked up. So, Mr. Nutterson, this is evidence in the strongest sense, corroborating your assertions that at all times you were fully aware, fully unaware of the illegality of these funds that you were receiving from
Correct,
Mr.
yeah.
Brian van Wyk that had been routed through Coronacre. Correct.
Yeah, he had made, obviously before this, at the time, he had made several undertakings that it was definitely not government money. And this goes back towards, obviously in this conversation, I had to get him to admit that.
Was this a solicited phone call?
No, not at all. He had called me.
Was
actually.
this planned in any way?
No,
Had you discussed the scripting of this particular discussion?
definitely not.
It doesn't appear so, because it's very poor scripting if it is. But so he phoned you, you answered the call, you said, I'll phone you back, you recorded
you
the
back when I'm in the
conversation, and this is a transcript of what transpired. And
That's
from
correct.
this transcript, it is abundantly evident that you had no knowledge of the fact that the source of the funds was either SA Express or that the funds had any illegal source whatsoever.
That's correct.
Okay. Chair, I think I'm going to leave it there, and then we can get on to
Yes.
the rest of the...
Okay, are you able to give some indication of how much more time you need?
The only other thing I really want to deal with, Chair, is the affidavit of Mr. Lowenthal, and then very briefly, just the two affidavits
Yes.
by the two employees of
Yes.
Mr. Nutterson, but that will be very brief.
Okay.
So I would say I'm hoping to do it in the next hour.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that's fine. Let's take an adjournment of 10 minutes. We'll resume at 4:10. We
Chair.
adjourn.
All rise.
Okay, let's proceed.
Sorry, Chair, I'd just like to refer Mr. Nuttison to,
You can put on yours as well, Mr. Matteson. Yeah.
I'd just like to refer Mr. Nuttison to the affidavit of Howard Andrew Lowenthal. It is VN 238.274. The bundle.
Which bundle again?
Bundle A,
It's the affidavits bundle.
it's right at the back of A.
It's exhibit.
Oh, at the back of A, okay. Yes, thank you.
Mr. Nuttison, you testified earlier that NEO had ex post facto the last attendance at the Commission of Inquiry appointed Mr. Lowenthal. Just take us through that appointment.
So he's an independent expert that was recommended by the legal team. I have had no interaction with him before. He's not a friend, an associate in any other way. He's a truly independent person that's been brought on board just to help me, firstly with the reconstruction, and secondly with the mandate around accounting for the monies, and thirdly relating to the issue of my role as a chartered accountant in business.
Mr. Nuttison, much has been made of the fact that certain persons with whom you've had dealings with have been remunerated for their services, such as Mr. Udil for his travel expenditure and ancillary expenditure, and Mr. Lowenthal for the production of this expert report. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. What inference do you draw by that line of questioning?
I assume the questioning the independence of the parties that were involved at this point as independent experts.
Okay. Well, that's how I understood it as well. Do you believe that Mr. Lowenthal is completely independent?
I believe it is.
Okay. Do you believe that he is skilled and experienced enough to handle the mandate that was given to him?
From the credentials presented to me, yes.
And from your dealings with him?
From my dealings, he's been professional and he seems to be getting to the grips with the issues very quickly.
Is he very knowledgeable?
He
As an
appears
accountant?
knowledgeable in the interactions I've had. He appears knowledgeable.
Okay. What was the mandate that was given to Mr. Lowenthal?
Was again to assist with the reconstruction of the books. Initially it was just over the years affected by these transactions, but we found that in order to reconstruct the books, we had to go all the way back to the end of 2014, which is the last SARS audited year, and rebuild from then onward. So his scope has been increased to cover 2015, year-end 2015, 2016, and 2017.
Did Mr. Lowenthal have difficulties in fulfilling his mandate?
Not that I'm aware of. Obviously, the collation of data and securing of documents is obviously an issue, but it's part of his findings, really.
But what were the real issues there? Just take us through them.
It appears when in terms of the financial records of 2016, they had to be totally rebuilt from scratch because the pastel had been overwritten. So we've been recapturing. So what he did at the start of his mandate was he actually opened up new pastel ledgers and then guided the accounting team now on the chart of accounts that was to be created, as well as the capturing process. Where there's uncertainty, they post to a suspense account, and then he reviews the suspense account when the documents come, and then allocates that to the appropriate account in the reconstruction process.
So that's if I can refer you specifically to paragraph 7, where Mr. Lowenthal confirms his mandate. 7.3 specifically, it's on page 2 of his affidavit. You can just read that.
To investigate how 9.9 million had flowed in two separate tranches of 5 million and 4.9 million on the 11th and 12th of November from a company, Coroneka Training and Projects, to Neo Solutions net bank account, and subsequently paid out in 5 tranches, 4 million, 3 million, with the respective dates, and then a further 1.4 million and 1.2 million, which was paid out in March of 2016. He goes on further to reflect the payments to Batsamai Investment Holdings were accounted for in the accounting records of Neo Solutions, and to reallocate such flows, if appropriate, to correctly nominated ledger accounts, and to account for them for the further 5th tranche, being a further 300,000 Rand that was paid out in cash, according to Mr. Nattison, to a driver of Van Wyk.
Okay. So besides the fact that he had to undertake a reconstruction of NEO's financials several years back dating 2018, in addition to that, and more specifically, he was tasked with an inquiry into the receipt of the 9.9 million from Coroneka and how that was dealt with in the books of account of NEO. And then he was further tasked, if I understand correctly, and you can correct me if any of this is wrong, he was further tasked with the correction of those entries to the extent that they were incorrect. Is that correct?
Well, we need to create financial records now to submit to SARS, because obviously those financial years now need to be put in. So that's part of his scope and mandate, is to
That's
assist
part of
in
it,
the
but
reconstruction.
specifically, he was asked, because obviously you were interrogated in examination in chief on the 9.9 and how it was accounted for in the books of account of NEO.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. And much was made on the 12th of July of the fact that there were various inconsistencies in the financials as well. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you did say on several occasions that it appeared that the books of account were incorrect.
Yes,
The financials were incorrect.
correct, especially around the donation.
Especially around the donations. And notwithstanding our vociferous pleas that no further examination should take place on the financials, the inquiry continued, did it not?
Yes,
Okay. And it was for that reason that you felt it incumbent to appoint Mr. Lowenthal to attend to the reconstruction, the identification of the various source documents, the application of those source documents to the books of prime entry, the reconciliations that were needed, the adjustments that may have been needed, etc., to bring the books of account into order.
that's correct.
Okay. Do you think he fulfilled his mandate?
Well, the reconstruction is still underway, but in terms of accounting for the monies, yes, he's done that.
He's done that.
Yes.
And where he says it's mostly accurate, would you agree with that submission by him?
Yes.
And how do you understand mostly accurate? What is your understanding? I know you've dealt with this before today, but if I can just get you to revisit that.
Well, my understanding is that specifically on the flow of monies, those are accurately recorded now. But in terms of obviously the 300,000, he's relied on my representation that it was paid.
Okay. But he doesn't have actual proof that it was paid because it was a cash transaction.
Correct.
But he relies on the fact that
It's my assertion.
your assertion, you paid those monies back.
And he's posted the
And
journal
that
according
and he's posted the journal into the NEO accounts. Okay. Just on that score, let's jump forward and go to the relevant paragraph where he deals with the application of the 300,000. My apologies, I'm just struggling to find it. This clean copy was given to me by my legal team and I had scratched and marked on mine. I'm now struggling to find the provision, specific provision. Anyway, I can from memory put to you that the way it was dealt with, that it was dealt with as an interest-free loan in the loan account of yourself
It's
in
in
Neo
clause
Solutions
14.
books.
I'm
Is that
assuming-
correct?
You're looking for clause 14,
Is it 14?
his findings relating to the money.
Yes, sorry, you're right.
What page is that?
Chair, that's page 6 of 11, and it's paragraph 14.
238.279.
That's paginated, page 238.279.
Yes.
Correct.
Okay. Thank
It says,
you.
accordingly, I instructed the accounting staff of Neo Solutions to reflect the monies, being the 9.9, funds held on interest-free loan account from Van Wyk and being recorded as liability in the loan ledger account due to the fact that the monies do not belong to Neo Solutions. So what Mr. Lowenthal was doing there, he was accounting for the 9.9 in the books of account of Neo Solutions, because if I understand correctly, and just correct me if I'm wrong, please, when the monies were capitalized into Neo, which were intended for the STAL ultimately, and the capitalization of that company for the purposes of the farming venture, it wasn't properly recorded in the books of account of Neo. Is that correct?
It was posted to my shareholder loan account.
And you understand why that is wrong, and that's actually
Correct.
something that you raised on the 12th. You said you weren't sure why it had been posted to your loan account.
That's correct.
Okay, but now we understand that Mr. Lowenthal, as an independent chartered accountant, has assessed the books of accounting. He's assessed that particular receipting of funds. He's looked at the intent of those funds, the intent with which those funds were paid over, as well as the nature of those funds, and he's concluded that the application of those funds should be dealt with in the following way, namely interest-free loan account and recorded as liability in the loan ledger. Correct?
That's right.
Okay. You also testified on the 12th and in all your statements, and I want to deal with this, there'll be an allegation of inconsistency as well, that you received no benefit, or Neo Solutions received absolutely no benefit whatsoever from the receipt of those funds from Mr. Van Wyk, which were conduited through Coronacre. In retrospect, given that your testimony was that you had received no benefit, is that still correct, that submission?
Well, we obviously now have found that there was an indirect benefit through the interest, the saving against the overdraft, so that's the response where we've now tended to obviously pay such interest back to the affected state institution.
Okay, so once you're told who that money should be paid back to, you're willing to pay that money back?
That's correct.
And once that money is paid back, do you believe that you've received any benefit of any nature whatsoever, say for maybe charges on the account that were unintended? Do you believe that you've received any benefit?
No.
None whatsoever?
It's even stated in the recording, which you didn't dispute,
Correct.
that we did not benefit.
Okay. So if you've received no benefit and you weren't aware of the unlawful source of the funds, why would you have participated in this transaction in the first place?
The intention was to go into business and the farming venture specifically. So we only participated to the extent that this was his share of the monies to come in to invest into the farming venture.
Right. And the farming venture was a real transaction?
Yeah, there's business plans. There's an email emanating from him where he reviewed the business plans.
Correct. And we've
So
given
he
all
was
the-
directly, I wasn't even on the project specifically myself. He worked with that, with Villa and the rest of the team in developing that business plan to give effect to the company.
Correct. And there's a record which we've given the Commission of all the documentation surrounding the farming venture.
Correct. The market valuations, the business plans and so on have been submitted as part
Okay,
of it.
so this was a legitimate venture that existed. This wasn't a fabrication of your imagination. This was a legitimate venture
Correct.
that you intended investing in with Mr. Van Wyk.
Correct.
And the 9.9 was his financial contribution to that transaction.
Well, it was 10 million each that had to go
Initially,
in for the 50-50.
but there would have been
yeah.
more. There would have been
Yeah,
more
then there was a
required
loan
later
to
on.
be secured. Yes.
Mr. Natterson, in furtherance of the legitimacy of that transaction, I'm going to refer you to the affidavits of Komla Jagdesi and Jerome Jones, who are two employees that work for you. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What capacity are they employed in?
Komla is my personal assistant, and Jerome is in the accounting unit.
And how long have they worked for you, respectively?
Komla since, I think, 2006 or 7. Jerome since 2011.
Okay. And they're salaried employees?
Yes.
Okay. And Mr. Natterson, tell me, in their affidavits, and I don't want to sit and read the whole affidavit, but effectively they mention the farming business transaction, and they mention that they've had various interactions with Mr. Van Wyk around that transaction.
Yes, that's right. I think, Chair, just to give context, I'm very rarely at the office. I'm normally out in the field on projects. So the interactions between Van Wyk, the accounting unit, the team on hand, if he needed a vehicle to go and inspect the farm and so on, he would get it issued from the company and they would just get approval for it in accordance with our policy. So a lot of the interaction on the day-to-day basis, if he was in the office, it would have been via the personnel that was on hand.
And you asked them to confirm by way of deposing to affidavits in respect of those interactions?
Correct, yes.
Okay. So is there any reason for these two employees to lie?
No, not at all.
Any reason for them to fabricate the whole transaction of a farming venture and Mr. Van Wyk's investment?
No, not at all.
Okay. So, I mean, for all intents and purposes, Mr. Natterson, this was a legitimate transaction that you intended investing in. And Mr. Van Wyk indicated that he had some interest, that he would like to invest as well, and that he had funds that were due to him from some other transaction which you skirtingly inquired. You asked as many questions as you thought were relevant and necessary in the circumstances. And he then paid that money over, as you understood, as part of him investing in this transaction with you. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. And that's what your staff believed? That's what you believed? Okay. That's what the documentation shows.
That's correct.
All the documentation supports that. Okay, so there's no reason to believe that this was, as is the case in many corrupt activities involving money laundering, corruption, maladministration, utilizing state funds, state capture. Most of those transactions, entities and businesses are set up as a front. Okay? Is that one of these cases?
Definitely not. And I did indicate in my previous testimony, I also took comfort from the fact that he didn't ask for the money back straight away. There was a full month that had elapsed before he requested the funds for, and it sounded like a genuine thing. He had mentioned to me previously that he was trying to secure a property in Blue Valley, and this, when he mentioned that he wanted the funds for that, I didn't see anything wrong with it. But from what we've seen so far, even on the Coroneka transactions, the money flows happened almost immediately to other conduits, and it was given back to him as quickly as possible. This was not the case with us.
Let's just leave that point for the moment and just quickly go to paragraph 15, and there's a discussion in Mr. Lowenthal's affidavit, or the content in that affidavit dealing with Reuben, who was, as you have testified, he was your internal accountant, he was a salaried employee, he was tasked with the handling of the internal accounts under your overall direction and control, but that you wouldn't advise him as to how the specific accounting entries would take place. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You gave him control of the accounts and he would oversee your account staff. Is that correct?
That's right. Because I was really in the office, he would manage all of that.
Okay. Mr. Lowenthal, at paragraph 15 says, further to the above, during the reconstruction of the accounting records and perusal of the source documentation of Neo Solutions, it came to my attention that Reuben had apparently misappropriated funds belonging to Neo Solutions, which the bookkeeper of Neo Solutions and myself calculate to date to be in the amount of approximately 746,689 rand and some cents. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is the current number. Chair, we identified this from where he had altered the beneficiary payee details to his own bank account. So the report that came from the bank was all payments made to that specific bank account, because it's difficult in the standard reporting system we have to be able to draw out the payee. It's only listed as the payee details, but not the actual bank account. So there was a special report that came from the bank where we identified so far these. We're still now searching for where he's altered or could have altered to pay to other beneficiary bank account details that might then increase this number.
Yeah. Mr. Nathan, it's not unsurprising then that the accounts were in a state of disarray.
Yes, I think from what we see now.
Do you suspect that Mr. Reuben had manipulated the accounts in order to potentially hide his fraud?
I think from looking at the accounting records and the lack of the missing documents that are there, we've clearly been sabotaged by him to cover up all these misappropriations.
Do you intend taking legal action against Mr. Reuben?
Yeah, we've obviously got this document with all the direct ones where he's changed it himself as we identify more, but we are obviously instituting a criminal case now.
Yeah. '23 and 24 of Mr. Lowenthal's affidavit very quickly. In light of the fact that Neo Solutions is a private company, the unaudited annual financial statements are drafted mainly for the attention and use of the sole director and sole shareholder, both Mr. Nuttison, and are not intended to be relied upon by third parties such as creditors. Accordingly, the annual financial statements are not audited and are compiled and used to reflect, be they inaccurate, the financial position and result of operations of Neo Solutions internally periodically. Much was made again of the fact that you had signed the financial statements and that you were a chartered accountant in business, and how could you have signed them without knowing unequivocally that every figure stated in those financial statements was correct? Correct?
Correct, yes.
You said you relied on Manny as the accounts firm that you had appointed for the production of these account statements, correct?
That's right.
What was your mandate to Manny?
The mandate, as I said, it had been based on what happened with the SARS process on the ADR, where he had given me undertakings that he would be the watchdog of ensuring that the books are correct going forward, especially with regard to further SARS submissions in the new financial years. So clearly, in the way he's now put his affidavit together, he's now reneging on that responsibility he took on. So it was far more than just taking the numbers that Eugene or Ruben had given him and just putting it into a set of financials. He was to interrogate the books much deeper than that.
And he didn't do that.
And he didn't do that.
So Mani actually breached its mandate to NEO.
Correct.
Okay. Evidence has been led regarding the affidavits filed, the statements filed by Mr. Patel on behalf of Mani, dealing with the Annexure G, which is your text message. We've dealt with that this morning. I don't intend revisiting it. I think you gave it the necessary context and interpretation which was required. But the fact remains that many breached their mandate to NEO. Then at the 11th hour after receiving a summons from the Commission, terminated their mandate. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Did they give you reasons for terminating the mandate?
No.
No. Did they engage with you in potentially reinvigorating the relationship and coming to your assistance to rectify the issues?
They did try. They currently perform other mandates for other entities that I'm a shareholder and director of. So they approached us via that entity to ask if they could obviously guide us in terms of responding. And they undertook then to give a confirmatory affidavit to us to support what exactly transpired at the meeting when we met on the 10th of July. And they reneged on that commitment literally this week.
So do I understand correctly that if they got further work through NEO, or
I think they were concerned that they would obviously lose their appointments at the other, which is significant revenues to them. They would obviously, by nature of terminating on one, they would have to terminate on all.
And on that basis, they were trying to backpedal.
Correct.
And come to the party.
That's correct.
Okay. That doesn't sound like a professional organization. It sounds like a firm of accountants that have breached their mandate and are only concerned about the financial implications to themselves as opposed to the financial implications to NEO.
That's correct.
Do you see an issue with that?
They obviously now, it's clearly indicating that they backtracked in and they've realized they made a mistake. Now they're not sure where they stand. But obviously all the appointments with us or any entity I'm associated with would be terminated.
Okay. Just to clarify the issue of the signature of the financial statements. So those financials, despite what my learned colleague has tried to assert, are only meant for internal purposes. Is that correct?
That's correct.
They weren't submitted to SARS?
These financials, definitely not. The last with SARS is 2014.
Were any submitted to any third parties?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Was that ever the intention?
No, no.
Okay. So they were for internal purposes more than anything else?
Yep.
Okay.
So although, yes, the banks had an obligation, or there is a contractual requirement there, the banks get a schedule from us. And that schedule shows all our incoming revenues per project, and they actually rely on that in terms of our overdraft facilities. And that goes to them monthly.
Is there any aspect of Mr. Lowenthal's affidavit which you disagree with?
No.
Do you think the steps that Mr. Lowenthal has taken in the reconstruction of the financials, in your opinion, either as a layperson in business, alternatively as a chartered accountant, do you think the steps are reasonable?
Yes.
Do you think they're the correct steps that had to be taken?
I think they keep us focused on ensuring that the transactions are being posted correctly now. For those periods.
Yes. Were the steps explained to you before they were taken? Did Mr. Lowenthal say, this is what I believe the issue is, this is what I think the solution is?
Yeah, he clarified his scope at the start of his appointment.
So, but for the main issues that needed to be rectified, he explained to you what form that rectification would take.
That's correct.
And why it was necessary, and you agreed with that?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not going to get into the independent chartered accountant and business issue again because I just don't think it warrants any further dealing or attention with. Mr. Knudsen, before I end off, do you believe many financial solutions?
Financial services.
So financial solutions, many financial solutions, that's how it's termed. Do you believe that they were negligent in giving effect to their mandate?
My understanding from that, when they approached me with that interaction now on the confirmatory, was they relied on an Excel spreadsheet from Ruben in order to compile the financials. And that doesn't make sense to me, because that was definitely not their mandate or the agreement and undertaking that they had given me.
And they were being remunerated for those services?
They've been remunerated for that.
Before I end off, and I'm almost there, thank you, Chair, I'd just like to ask you some questions generally regarding this inquiry. And I'd like to know what your subjective opinion is. I'm not asking you in your capacity as director of NEO, shareholder, chartered accountant. I'm just saying, subjectively, what is your opinion? Why do you believe that Ms. Tlatsana implicated you in this transaction? Given the recording that we've heard, your discussion with Mr. Van Wyk, given the fact that the farming venture was a legitimate transaction, given the fact that you were unaware of the source, the illegality of the source of the funds, given that the money was repaid in full and that you've tendered any benefit that you've received, why do you think you specifically, I know there were other people, why do you think you specifically were implicated by Ms. Tlatsana?
Well, we received the funds, so by virtue of us receiving those funds from Coroneka, we were implicated. However, we were the one party, so if Coroneka has received 51 million, which is started as Tlatsana's testimony, we received 9.9 of that. But through UDEAL, she was already in possession of the fact that the 9.9 had been paid back, yes, about the 300,000 issue, but it was paid to Batsamai, and they had already confirmed that Batsamai was Brian van Wyk's partner. So we were the one entity that had already cooperated to showing that the funds received had been returned to Van Wyk. Where the remaining parties, the 28 million or so that she's sitting with, has not been accounted for yet. The 9 million was literally laundered into cash and delivered by SPV to Brian's doorstep. The other parties, no mention has been made of where those funds have been gone. And to me, I can't understand why, as an entity that has proven at the start, when the commission started with us, we had given them the audio recording, which confirmed that I was unaware of the source of funds. So to me, 2 days of the commission's time has been spent on trying to prove I'm not a good accountant, as opposed to actually getting to the crux of where these funds have really gone from a state capture perspective. So I fail to understand why so much effort is trying to prove whether I reasonably ought to have known, when I can prove that I did not know, and I acted on the basis that these funds came from a dividend source that was going to be utilized in a venture with us. There's been no cover-up from my side. This is valid monies that, well, at the time, I thought it was valid monies and I was going into business with Van Wyk. I was not trying to mislead or hide or do anything untoward with these funds. When he started drawing his money back, we had given him back. So yes, there was an indirect benefit derived by us having held those funds, which we're now tendering to say we will reimburse the state for those that we've enjoyed the benefit of. But there's been no intention or knowledge that the funds were not not from a reputable source when we got them.
Did you say Ms. Tlatsana still has 20?
From what I recall, is in the region of 28 million that she's
28
at the
million
point where she seized the account codes back. There should have been 28 million somewhat. From the testimony and the recon that's there, that's 28 million still unaccounted for by herself.
Do you think that the fact that she was a willing participant, the fact that she ought to have known better, given the nature of the transaction that she was dealing with, and the fact that there are monies that she still has, in any way is connected or correlated with the fact that she's now left the Republic?
Well, I mean, I can't speculate on that. All I can say is that it's a matter of record that 28 million is still unaccounted for and she's refused to account on it. And I'm being called to account on whether I'm a good accountant or not.
And as far as you're aware, has Mr. Van Wyk been subpoenaed or summoned to this inquiry?
As far as I'm aware, well, I don't have any knowledge of that, so I'm assuming not yet.
Okay. Do you believe he should be here?
Well, through my evidence and Tlatsana's evidence, he's been implicated, so I think he should be here to account for his side as to what he's done with the money.
He's the common denominator, so to speak.
Correct.
Okay. Why do you think the Commission has focused so vigorously on your testimony. Why do you think?
Well, that's not re-examination.
No, it is. I need to ask.
That doesn't really arise from anything that was led earlier on.
But Chair, I don't understand it myself. And
Yes, but re-examination,
Okay.
as we both know, is there to clarify evidence that has been dealt with earlier.
as your Chair pleases. You still wish to cross-examine Ms. Tlatsana,
Yes, I
if
do.
given the opportunity, if she
Given the
returns to the Republic,
Correct.
and if the Commission obviously allows for it?
Yes.
And what do you want to examine her on? What specifically do you want to ask Ms. Tlatsana?
Well, specifically, how she accounted for the transaction. I've been asked to account right down to my financial statements as to how the transactions were accounted for in my books. So we need to deal with how it was accounted for on her side, whether she had ever interacted with me at any point in time during the flow of funds, because I had never met or spoken or didn't know of her existence at any point until UDEAL brought it to my attention in October of 2017. So it's obviously to confirm that I was not complicit or party to any of the state capture that occurred here.
Did you read the transcription of Ms. Tlatsana's evidence?
Yes?
Was she interrogated on her financial standing, her financials, the financials of Coroneka?
Not that I can see in there.
One moment, Chair. Chair, I think I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your indulgence. I apologize if I pushed the envelope in terms of the questions that I was asking and whether they were leading.
No, thank you.
And
Thank you.
I apologize if I may have unintendedly cast my esteemed colleague in bad light. It's not my intention. I apologize. And
thank you.
We're going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. If I may, just one or two concluding aspects.
Okay.
Chair, there is in our submission a fundamental reason why lawyers representing their clients do not ask leading questions of their clients when they examine them. There's also a fundamental reason why lawyers do not generally speak to their clients after they are called and before they are re-examined. Chair, the underlying reason is because it diminishes the credibility of the witness's evidence. And the reason for that is because the adjudicator or decision maker is then not left with clarity as to whether the answers given by the witness are the witness's answers or they are the sculpted answers of a lawyer. Chair, at the commencement of Mr. Pienaar's questions, I raised the concern about the leading questions.
Yes.
I raised this simply because it's not simply that it's a rule of ethics, it's because it undermines the evidence of the witness. And I draw it to your attention, Chair, because in due course, we will submit to you that you should take that impact of the type of questioning and the type of engagement into account when you weigh Mr. Natterson's evidence today. Thank you, Chair. Chair, one last thing. Just Mr. Natterson recently gave evidence about Ms. Tlatsana refusing to submit an account of her financials. Chair, you'll recall in her evidence she undertook to do so, and in the explanation I gave this morning, the evidence of her attorney, which I read out to the hearing, indicated that she had appointed an auditor to do so.
Yes.
So it's not clear to me where Mr. Natterson obtained the information that she had refused to account for those funds. It was a matter that we did ask her, and you specifically indicated you would want after her testimony.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Natterson. We have come to the end of your evidence. Should a need arise in the future, and I don't know if it will arise, for the Commission to request you to come back, you will be requested. But for now, you are excused.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We are going to adjourn the proceedings. Ms. Hofmeyer, tomorrow we start normal time?
We do indeed,
We can
Chair.
start at normal time.
Safely so.
Yes, okay. We adjourn.
All rise.
Okay. Can I throw this in there? Yes. Thank you. What other files do we have? We've got these ones. Oh, we've got extra files from today. So we should have 6 now.